hear me? Okay.
Yes.
If you just joined us, council has been meeting since about 12:30. So I think we had a 3-minute break between meetings. So your patience here is appreciated. Sorry, we're running a little bit late. Today is April 12th at 2023. Let's see. To acknowledge that I'm being recorded. This is a work session, and I don't know if Nancy is available to do a roll call. Layla, is that possible, or do we just?
Well, we're all here.
Linda, I can't hear you.
Oh, geez.
Are you on mute?
No.
Oh, I can hear her.
I
I
can
can't hear you.
You can hear me?
Can you hear me?
I can hear everybody.
I hear everyone.
I'm not hearing anybody, actually.
Uh-oh.
I can even hear Brad's exhaust fan above his head.
Technical difficulties. Can you all hear me? Can you hear me?
Yes,
Yep.
I can. Yes.
Okay, because I can't hear anybody. Layla, can you, is there something I can do so that I can hear you?
Do you want me
Yeah, so if you go to that little carrot,
to?
oh, you can't hear me.
Good question.
Yeah.
I'm missing all the good jokes.
That's a cement truck, Jerry, not a.
Do you want me to go back out and? Yes?
I'm using microphone because when I put it.
Okay, mm-hmm.
Why don't you mute yourself? See, can you hear me now? Yeah, I'll hang up. Can you hear me now? Okay, then you're good. You just need to unmute now.
Oh, good.
All right. What a day.
Let's pass it around to everybody.
We-
have some
I
technical
ran into this
difficulty.
with Linda's computer earlier today, so it seems to be some sort of a contagious thing. Let's see. Nancy was going to do a roll call to make sure, but is she there to do that, or shall we just?
I am here. Do you want me to
Okay,
do that?
Nancy. Yes, if
Okay.
you would, please. Thank you.
All right, Linda,
Here.
Jerry,
Here.
Jenna,
Here.
Brad,
Here.
and Deb.
Yes, finally here. Thank you. And thank you to all the citizens who are listening in and participating in your city's government. We appreciate your support. Since this is a work session today, there will be no public comment at this meeting. And first on our agenda is the revenue diversification presentation. And I believe I saw Laura Lee, the president of Eco Northwest. Laura, there you are. Thank you for being with us today again. So Layla, I will turn this meeting over to you to walk us through.
Okay, great. Well, I'm pretty much just going to hand the baton over to Lorelei. They've been working hard on the last time we met. Council gave direction to the team to proceed with conducting some analyses on 4 options, just to give us a sense of what the potential revenue could be generated from those options. I should note, and I think probably Lorelei will too, that these aren't the only 4 options available to us. They were the 4 options that we decided to, within our contract, have them test. So I think with that, Lorelei, I'll let you take it and run from here.
All right, that sounds great. Thank you, Layla. I appreciate it. I am going to start by sharing my screen and telling you what we're up to today. So just as a quick reminder, Eco Northwest, that's me and my colleague Angelica, who is also on the line with us today, together with Ghilardi Rothstein Group, and that's Deb Ghilardi, who is here and you will hear from throughout this presentation, have been working for the last several months to try to really do an analysis of the options that are available to you all to diversify your revenue streams. The goal of the project is not to take it all the way to the point where you would have a specific new revenue stream that you would be implementing, but instead to begin the conversation by helping to illuminate why you might need to have a diversification of the revenue streams, where you have specific funding gaps, and then to evaluate a couple of options that you can further consider in later steps. Today, what we're going to do is I'm going to give you a very brief reminder of some of the things that we talked about when I was here previously regarding why it's important to think about new revenue sources. And then since we last met, our teams have been busy crunching some numbers, and we have some preliminary revenue estimates for the 4 top revenue tools that we talked about last time. So starting with that brief recap, and all of this is information we went over previously, so I'll go over it pretty quickly, and don't hesitate to raise your hand if you've got some questions that you would like me to address. The first point is that y'all are not alone. Almost every city in the state of Oregon and every county and every special district is facing challenges with having sufficient revenue to cover costs, for the very simple and obvious reason that costs are increasing faster than local government revenue sources are allowed to increase because of state statutory limits. So you all are not alone. You're facing similar challenges to everybody, but there are some ways in which your challenges are different. First of all, your economy is built around tourism, which has a specific set of costs associated with it, but also has a set of revenue tools that are specific to tourism. And then also that in part because of the tourism economy, the revenue sources that you have been historically using are not necessarily lining up with your needs. So we need to pay attention to this and figure out what the solutions could be. So this is big picture takeaway from the analysis that we presented last time. Your revenues, the biggest funding source that you have is the transient lodging tax and also your short-term rental permit fees. And second home development means that you've got some property tax growth coming from that and some one-time development fees as well that are related to the tourism economy. But you've got additional costs associated with that. You've got overnight visitors that are putting pressure on some of your core services like parking. You've got visitor amenities that you need to provide, and you've got additional people driving on your roads that are contributing to the need for road maintenance. The resident population by the same token is producing some revenue to cover core infrastructure and other costs, but generally speaking, because the population is not growing particularly quickly, those incomes are flat. And as I mentioned previously, this is not a unique position that you are in, but you have a very, very low property tax rate relative to other communities, one of the lowest in the state. And for that reason, your resident population is contributing proportionately less to covering core services than other cities' resident populations are contributing. So our conclusion from looking at this overall picture is that we need to be looking for new revenue sources, yes, that derive from visitor and second home ownership, but also are engaging the resident population in really providing some of these core services that benefit everybody. Specifically, we have challenges with the transportation system. You've got some increase in maintenance costs and some future capital improvements that need to be covered, and a lack of resources that are dedicated and available to meet those needs. And then you've got a specific gap related to managing the tourism economy. There's some code enforcement and trash collection, those kinds of things that create quality of life issues for everybody in town that really need to be addressed. And then you have a fair amount of revenue coming in from overnight visitors in the form of the short-term rental tax, but not much that's capturing day trippers. So those are a couple of the funding gaps. What can we do to create a healthier picture? So the last time that we met, we talked about the general obligation bond, transportation utility fee, prepared food and beverage sales tax, and parking fees as 4 revenue sources that we wanted to dive into and really understand a little bit better. I'll just give you a quick reminder of what each of those tools, what they are and how they function. And Deb, I might ask you to jump in if I miss anything or if there's anything that you want to highlight after I've gone through, okay? Deb Ghilardi specifically.
Deb Ghilardi.
You are also welcome to jump in if you would like.
Anytime.
All right, so a general obligation bond it's a bond, it's for a dollar amount. It can be used for any kind of capital infrastructure, but in this case, the need that would be served would be for transportation infrastructure. It does require voter approval, and depending on how it's structured, it can be a 10 or 20-year bond. A transportation utility fee is exactly what it sounds like. It's an additional fee that's tacked onto a utility bill, and it can be used for a wide range of things. But in this case, given the gap on transportation maintenance and infrastructure, that's where we would look at it being used. A prepared food and beverage sales tax. When I was here last time, I told you that it needed voter approval, and it turns out that's true, but only in some cases, and you are not one of those cases. So I need to retract that. You can adopt a the city of Manzanita can adopt a prepared food and beverage sales tax by resolution. In other places, their city charters require this to go to a vote. So you don't have that limitation. That money can be used for a wide range of things, but in this case, we would think about it as, because you're capturing money from the day trippers through the prepared food and beverage sales tax, we would think about that as being used for tourism management or for transportation infrastructure. And then last but not least, parking fees. A lot of questions that we'll get into later in the presentation around how that kind of a program would be developed. But highest picture, you're putting in place some meters and you're capturing revenue either by the hour or overnight or both from people who are driving through. And you could use those revenues for tourism management or transportation infrastructure. I just want to talk a little bit about who pays for these things, because this is one of the really important questions when we're thinking about revenue sources, is the nexus between who pays and who benefits from the funding sources themselves, and also the nexus between who pays and who imposes the costs. So to make it very clear, a general obligation bond is funded directly by property owners, and that would be all property owners, including people who own short-term rentals and commercial businesses. But indirectly, for those that can pass on the cost of the additional tax increase to either patrons or overnight visitors, they would do that. So indirectly, there would be other people paying for some of that cost. Transportation utility fee similarly is paid primarily or directly by property owners, but to the extent that it's possible to pass those costs on, property owners would do that. Prepared food and beverage sales tax is people who go to restaurants, and then parking fees is people who park. pretty straightforward. You can obviously develop a parking program that is not for all people who park. You can create a program that exempts, for example, full-time residents. Deb Gallardi, anything you want to add to that overview that you feel like I've missed so far?
Not at this point.
All right, fantastic. And any questions? Because so far we haven't covered anything new. I've managed to talk for like 10 minutes without giving you any new information yet. Okay, we'll keep moving in that case. Last time I was here, I told you that we would be looking at these 4 tools relative to a set of criteria. And so this is the analysis I'm going to be presenting next. So we'll be thinking about the amount of money that can be generated by each of these tools, whether they're stable over time, whether there's fairness, whether there's a nexus between those who pay and those who impose costs, whether the tools can be used flexibly or whether they match the needs of the city, the ease of administration, how expensive or difficult is it to put a new program in place, neutrality, does it create new behaviors to try to avoid the cost? And then last is ease of implementation. Do we need to send this to the voters, or is this something that the council can do? And are there any issues related with legality? Okay, so here's our big picture overview of the evaluation of the revenue options. And I'll just highlight that on this very first column, the funding capacity, I've got a set of slides where I'll show actual numbers for each of these 4 tools coming up. So just to hit the high points here, with the general obligation bond, the funding capacity is pretty high because frankly, so it's a dollar amount. You ask the voters to agree to fund an amount with a property tax increase. There are limitations on the upper dollar amount that the city can take out in general obligation bonds, but in general, the question is willingness to pay. Is the dollar amount that would be needed so high that local residents would be concerned about the amount of increase in property taxes and would therefore vote it down? So the funding capacity is quite high. You could cover quite a lot of cost with a general obligation bond. It's very stable, extremely stable, because it just comes in through property taxes, and the assessor actually works backward to figure out the precise amount that taxes need to increase in order to cover the obligation of the bond each year. The folks who pay are property owners, and because that is encompassing of both full-time residents and people who own second and vacation homes and people who own short-term rentals, it's really capturing the full range of people who are both imposing costs and benefiting from the funding that would come through. It's flexible, that we're giving it a kind of high on flexibility because it can be used to fill the specific funding gap that we've identified for you all, which is on transportation capital needs. So it works well for that. Pretty easy to administer. There's not a lot that the city needs to do once it's been put in place to be able to gather those revenues. It doesn't cause a lot of change in behavior. And I would say that that is particularly true because your starting place property tax rate is so low that increasing it would not put you in a position where you would have competitive challenges with neighboring jurisdictions in terms of rates. And then ease of implementation is the one place where we see some challenges, and that is it does require voter approval. Okay. I'm going to keep moving. Transportation utility fee, similarly, and Deb can talk more about this and will talk about this when we get into the details. You can get quite a lot of funding capacity off of it. It's very stable because it comes off of utility bills that are paid monthly by everybody who connects into the utility system. Similar to the general obligation bond, everybody pays, so its fairness is high. It is more flexible than a GO bond because it can be used for capital expenses that are needed. Very easy to administer, similar kind of neutrality. And then there is a rate setting process that the city would need to go through to figure out what the dollar amount would be. It's not a big challenge to go through, but we gave it a medium rating for that reason. Prepared food and beverage tax, we say it's medium here. I will say when we reveal the numbers, it was higher than I thought it was going to be, but it's still lower than what you could get from a general obligation bond or a transportation utility fee. So we gave that a medium rating for funding capacity. Medium rating for stability because it will fluctuate based on the seasonality of your tourist cycles. Similarly, on the fairness piece, medium, because it could potentially have effects on your business owners. Very flexible, can be used for capital and operations. Fairly simple to administer. It does require some monitoring and collection work to put a program in place. There may or may not be changes in behavior from the result of a tax that is put in place on food and beverage. You may see some people opting to go to restaurants in other communities that don't have the tax. I think that's an open question, but we gave it a medium rating for that reason. And then even though you all can implement this on your own through a resolution, it has been fairly contentious in other communities and does require some community support to get through. And then the last one, parking fees. The funding capacity will vary quite a lot depending on the kind of program that you put together. But our initial analysis suggests that it doesn't have as much capacity as any of the other tools that we're looking at here. It will fluctuate and depend on visitor traffic over time. It kind of depends. This fairness question of who pays depends on how you structure the program and who you ask to pay and how you ask them to pay. So we gave it a medium rating for that reason. The funding is very flexible, though. You can use it for pretty much whatever purposes you would like. Administration ease, it does require ongoing enforcement. This is a hurdle that many other cities have figured out how to overcome, but it will take some planning and some work to make that happen. We may see some behavior change. We may see people choosing to park in areas that are not metered. And I think that's a really important thing to keep in mind when you're developing the program itself. And we'll get to some more details on that in a moment. And then last but not least, it does require some infrastructure investment up front and some kind of thinking about how you're going to manage enforcement and some upfront expenses to make sure that you've got those enforcement pieces in place. So that's our big picture overview of how those 4 funding sources line up relative to the criteria that we've identified. I'm going to pause for a moment, highlighting that we're going to be talking more about each of these with some actual funding capacity numbers, but just pause for a moment and see if there's anything here that you want to react to or have questions about.
Lorelei, I do have a question about the general obligation bond. Do you have a sense, from your work around the state, how high or how difficult a threshold that is to gain voter approval? Obviously, every community is different and every bond package is different, but I guess my gut sense would be some bond packages for needed infrastructure have an easier time than some other bond packages. Do you have any kind of wisdom from around the state you can share with us on that?
Right. So you bond not just for a specific amount, but for a specific set of projects when you go for a general obligation bond. So if those projects are something that the community really wants to see, they're beautiful new parks that are going to serve everybody, or their transportation investments that everybody knows that they need, it's much easier to get the package through if you can generate momentum and a community enthusiasm about the projects themselves.
Okay.
Lorelei, I had a question kind of on the tail end of that. On the food and beverage tax, I think in Cannon Beach, they designated that that revenue would be split partway between the fire department and the city hall. So who determines where those monies go? Could we say it's just for workforce housing or half of it's going to be used for road maintenance? What's that process?
That's up to you all. Keeping in mind, though, that you can't necessarily tie the hands of future councils with the way that general fund dollars are set up. So
Okay.
you might have to create a special purpose fund or something like that if you really wanted to make sure that they were dedicated to a particular purpose.
Okay. Thank you.
Shall we look at some dollars? Seems like that's where everybody gets really excited. How much money do we have to spend if we do this? We'll start with the general, this is a general obligation bond. We have color coded these, so everything about the general obligation bond is going to be yellow, tough is orange, just to help you kind of keep track of where we are in the presentation. So what I'm showing here is information that Layla provided to us that just helps us get a sense of what the capital project revenue needs might be that you would want to go to bond for. So these are really meant, you should think about these as just an example. This isn't necessarily the package that you would want to put forward for a GO bond, but just to give us something to work with, you know, this is kind of what we were looking at, is these 4 projects: a water construction, some stormwater construction, roads, and then bringing us to a total of about $8 million of projects that would need to be funded. You have some existing revenue sources that would help to underwrite that, so you wouldn't need to necessarily bond for the full amount. And the way that we thought about this was, let's just pretend that you take out a bond for a portion of those projects at 4 million. Maybe you want to go midway, 6 million. Maybe you want to do that whole enchilada, 8 million. What would that actually mean for the actual millage rate and payment from an individual house? So that's how we have thought about this. So to get to a $4 million bond, your annual payment, if you happened to be so lucky as to go to the bond market and get a 3.5% interest rate, your annual payment as a city would be $272,000. The increase in millage rate would be 0.87. And because you have such a low starting place property tax for the city, the increase it basically doubles. But the amount additional that a $400,000 home would pay with that $4 million bond in place is about $180 per year. So does that math make sense to you all? If you're getting an $8 million bond, a home that's assessed at $400,000 would pay an additional $360 per year. We wanted to look at this 2 different ways, because it seems unlikely that you would get a 3.5% interest rate. We did pull information from the municipal bond rate and term sheet and found that there have been bonds that have been let at 3.5% recently. But on the likelihood that you would have a higher interest rate, what would that look like? And you can see that the numbers jump, but not dramatically. The main difference is in the amount of interest that the city would have to pay. So your annual payment goes up, but the impact on an individual house is not dramatic. I think I see a hand there. I can't see everybody.
Hi, Lorelai, it's Jenna.
Hi.
Can you just explain a little bit about assessed value? I think maybe the public might see like there's no homes here that are $400,000. They're all way more than that. But can you explain taxes and property taxes and how that works?
Absolutely. Thank you for that question. That's a really very important point, because our taxation system in Oregon uses 2 numbers: a real market value, which is much closer to what you might buy or sell a home for. And in Manzanita, many of your homes are much higher than $400,000. And then they also use an assessed value. The assessed value is sometimes half as much as the real market value. This is all because of some property tax limitations that went into the Constitution in the 90s, that there's a separation between real market and assessed value. Your assessed value is the number that is used for taxation purposes. So the millage rate is applied to the assessed value, not the real market value, and it's quite a bit lower than the real market value. Okay. So that's part of what led to our assessment that the funding capacity for a general obligation bond is quite high. You could go higher than 8 million if you needed to. Like I said earlier, there are limits on how high of a bond the city can take out. But given that your capital needs, at least as communicated so far, have been around the $8 million mark, it felt likely that they'd be able to be covered. Okay, I'm going to let Deb talk about transportation utility fees for just a moment.
Sure. So the transportation utility fee, or TUF, is used by dozens of cities in Oregon, and I'd say probably more frequently in small cities. I'm working with a couple of moderate to larger size cities now to implement, but they are, the ease of implementation and the potential for revenue generation make them appealing. Here, I've kind of modeled this after the Coos Bay transportation utility fee, using that differential of $10 per month for a residential account and $20 a month for non-residential, just to illustrate the potential for revenue generation on a yearly basis. And of course, there's lots of flexibility in how those charges are structured. In some cases where there's a lot of variation in the types and sizes of non-residential commercial businesses, they might be scaled based on the square footage of the business, because that relates to the potential for trips generated by that business activity. In Bay City, they actually assess it based on water use. It's on the water bill, but it's also scaled based on the amount of water use. That's fairly uncommon, but certainly administratively more simple. These are just inside the city. So even though the city has outside, water system customers, this revenue estimate is just based on inside city. And it is based on the assumption that lodging rooms would be charged on a per room basis. Again, for just illustration purposes, I've assumed $10 per month per lodging room, consistent with short-term rentals and all other residential property. So just under 200,000 based on these estimates, and based on our review of the budget at the last meeting, which, this would be combined with the other revenues generated within the transportation fund, generate about $300,000 total, which would cover the operation and maintenance costs in the street fund and also provide some level of funding for capital, somewhere in the $100,000 to $150,000 per year. So, happy to answer any questions about that.
There are, just to be clear, there are no interests incurred with the TUF edition, like there would be with a bond.
Correct. Yeah, this works just like the water utility fees, in that it's a charge on the bill, and it's revenue back to the city. There's some administrative costs, associated with the billing, but you already do billing for the water rates. So adding an additional line item on the bill should not be very expensive.
Deb, did you say you could set the rates? I know you used $10. Did you say that you could set the rates based on what type of, is that what this is saying, like a short-term rental? You could set a different rate, or would you have to set the same rate?
Yeah, great question.
Types of houses.
So generally, back to what Lorelei was talking about in terms of nexus, for transportation utility fees, the impact is generally measured by trips generated. So even though, so it really comes back to we don't have, city doesn't have the ability to really estimate that for individual properties. And, but there is national data available. I think it would be hard to differentiate between, a short-term rental that has people coming, that turns over and has different occupants over the course of a month with a resident, full-time resident that has people in the house that are just the same people, over the course of the month. So do the trips generation or the impact on the transportation system, does that vary just because it's a short-term rental? Maybe. But it is certainly within the policy realm of the council to make decisions about those charge bases. I would just say, within reason, that could be defensible.
As a follow-up, did you say you could base the fee on water usage?
Well, that's what Bay City does, and there's probably at least one other community that does it that way. When you think about it, so one thing we are trying to do with these fees, back to Nexus, is have some scaling mechanism that allows you to differentiate between a very large kind of business, maybe a large grocery store, and a smaller kind of business. Now, does a large grocery store generate a lot more water than a smaller one? Does the water use scale at the same proportion as the trips? Probably not. But again, it's there are limited bases, particularly where there is information readily available already in the billing system. So that's always one of the considerations with these types of things. And one of the reasons why some of the larger cities haven't gone this route is because there is such a diversity of commercial customers that really, to do it fairly, you have to go to something like square footage of the building. And you can imagine how difficult that is in some places to determine for each individual customer account. So that's why we sometimes use other factors that are already in the billing system, like water use. Though for this type of fee, I would say it's most common just to do a flat fee per month based on the type of use. And you could differentiate between on commercial, between like office type use and restaurants, say, because generally going to have a higher trip generation from a restaurant than you are an office.
All right. Any other questions on that one?
No, thank you.
Great. All right. Moving on then, prepared food and beverage sales tax. Just wanted to bring forward a couple of example cities. These are, there may be a couple of additional cities out there that also have prepared food and beverage tax, but Ashland certainly has had theirs the longest. And then more recently, Cannon Beach and Yachats have added this tax. Ashland gets about $2 million a year from theirs. Cannon Beach, $1.7 million. But as you noted, it is split with the fire district, so the city takes half of that. And then in Yachats, we're seeing about $370,000 per year. So these things can generate some revenue. So for our math, we pulled confidential quarterly employment and wages data from the state to identify all of the businesses that fall into a category of prepared food and beverage. And then based on the size of those businesses and the number of employees, estimated the amount of sales that they would get and came up with 8.15 million. I will say that if you move forward with the prepared food and beverage sales tax, you will want to use data from your local as much as possible from the actual restaurants to ground truth this, because there's not a good way for us to deal with seasonality. And additionally, new restaurants that are planned, we didn't have a good way to capture those. So my guess is that this is a little bit of an underestimate, or at least it will be when your new major restaurant is complete and operational. But assuming that this is in the ballpark, we're looking at somewhere between $400,000 and maybe $600,000 per year, depending on the percent of the tax that you put in place. So this one's pretty straightforward. It's just a tax that goes straight on to the bill each time someone pays at the restaurant and goes to the city.
Could this be a seasonal bill? We talked at our last meeting that like the summer season is May 15th through September 15th. Is this something that, that I wouldn't say that there's really an off season anymore in Manzanita, but, to kind of impact our winter residents less? Is this something that you could do during a certain time period?
I mean, it's technically possible. There's a lot of administrative challenges with that, because once you've got the system all set up to impose it, figuring out how to turn it on and off and when to turn it on and off can become a challenge.
Is it also possible to do like residents are exempt? Full-time residents would maybe have a pass. I can't remember which city I was in, but the residents didn't have to pay the F&B, and they had a little card that they showed, so it wasn't added on to the bill. Is that, do you know anything
I wonder
about
if that was something that the restaurant itself was doing as a way to encourage local residents to come in, if they were covering the food and beverage tax themselves? I'll have to look into that to better understand the legality of that, but my gut tells me that that would be not possible or practical, but that there may be workarounds. I can look into that. Okay. Anything else on that one? Okay, well, let's talk about the most complicated one in that case, which is paid parking. I mean, what it is pretty obvious: metered parking in commercial district, or it could be citywide with some sort of a permit program. There are a lot of questions that the city would need to think through if it wanted to go down this road of trying to put in place a paid parking program. And I would really encourage you to bring on a consultant or someone who's an expert specifically on paid parking programs. The kinds of questions that you'll need to think about is who's paying? Are you looking just at overnight visitors, or are you trying to capture all residents? Are you looking at a virtual or a hard infrastructure program? So is this one that people manage entirely through their phones in a virtual way, or are there actual meters that are set up on the streets? If you're not doing a kind of permit program that covers wide swaths, you have to think about walkability and sidewalk access so that people can easily get to and from where your parking is located. You got to think about where you want it to be. Do you have city-owned lots that would be good places, or is it only on the streets? And then you have to think about the time period. Is this something that would be enforced year-round, or would you look at it only during high season? So lots of questions that make it, without the answers to that, make it really hard to think about how to estimate the revenue, but we tried, and I'll show you. We took two runs at thinking about this. The first was based on some trip estimates of the number of folks that are coming into the city of Manzanita, and applied some assumptions about how many of them would be parking and what the rates might be. And then the other method that we used is to look at Hood River's program. They have a kind of similar, their downtown core has recently implemented a paid parking program, and they have a similar amount of traffic coming in and a similar kind of seasonality to you all. So that seemed like it was a good example for us to use. This is Hood River's parking program, and so just wanted you to get a sense of the geographic scale of it by putting this map up. They do have 705 total on-street parking spaces. And those are all denoted here in red. So kind of a similar scale to what you would be thinking about, and additionally have some lots. So the first option, which is based on trip visits, ODOT trip counters give you about 795, nearly 800,000 average annual trips. If we make the rough assumption that 60% of those are parking, and of those, about 32% are parking for less than 2 hours. The reason that we used those numbers is that if you remember, I should have brought this slide in from the past presentation, but we had some cell phone data that we showed you last time that captured how long people were staying, and 32% of people who drive into the city of Manzanita are staying for less than 2 hours. So that's why we use that number. And we're assuming $1 an hour because that's pretty consistent with what other communities are charging. And we assumed no overnight parking fee simply because we don't have an easy way to understand what that would look like or where that would be applied or how, just for the sake of simplification. And then option B, the Hood River one, we took their per stall revenue estimate and assumed that you would get the same amount of revenues for a program that you implemented in Manzanita. So obviously this is really rough math. If you wanted to move forward with this, you would need to dig in more deeply, and you would need to look at it together with kind of those programmatic decisions to understand how the different programmatic decisions affect the amount of revenue that could be generated. But to jump to the conclusion and show you the results, the trip model got us to about $198,000, nearly $200,000 per year. And then based on the Hood River model, if you had 200 stalls versus 500 stalls, we got very specific with you down to the cent, about somewhere between $153,000 and $383,000 per year. So kind of no matter how you look at it, you're in that range of $200,000 to $300,000. Administrative costs for parking programs are higher. The graph that you're showing here is straight out of an analysis that was done for the City of Hood River's program. What you're seeing in the black line is the expenditures, and in the yellow line, the revenues. And you can see that they do kind of scale with each other. The more revenue you're getting, the more it costs to get that revenue. That makes sense because the stronger your enforcement is, the higher your revenue is, but it costs money to get the enforcement to work. So really would not be able to estimate administrative costs without understanding the answers to some of those key questions about how the program would be structured. They could range anywhere from 1/4 to 1/3 of revenues, and they might vary seasonally because you might choose to only enforce during high season, for example. You would collect revenues from people who are willing to pay year round, but you might only choose to enforce and have that expensive enforcement during high season. So there's other kinds of choices that would affect your costs as well. There are both upfront and ongoing needs. You may have some infrastructure investments that are needed to get actual meters installed, and ongoing needs, which would be related to enforcement and maintenance of the system. But in general, administrative costs are going to eat up a chunk of your revenues. So for all of those reasons, I'm just going to jump to the recommendations, and then we can come back to questions on paid parking. As Layla said at the very top, we looked at these 4 because they're the ones that came to that felt like they needed the deeper dive and the support of this conversation to get into, but you shouldn't ignore the other sources. Systems development charges in particular would be very useful for you to take a look at after you complete your transportation system plan, which I know you all are working on right now. And you should just continue to pay attention to the existing revenue sources that you've got from permits and utilities to make sure that they're aligning with costs. But as we stood back and looked at this, a TUF felt like the most likely and most beneficial near-term move because it aligns with your highest need in transportation and it's relatively easy to implement. At the same time, we think it's probably worth thinking about a parking study because remember, the only reason revenue is not the only reason to think about paid parking. It also helps you to manage an actual parking problem and could have benefits related to quality of life and mobility in addition to the revenue piece of it. So getting a clearer picture of what a parking program might look like and continue the conversation about the food and beverage tax seems like a logical next step. The general obligation bond, we didn't include as a potential next step, primarily because the TUF feels like it can take a pretty good chunk out of your capital needs without having to go to a public vote. So I'm going to pause, see if there are additional questions about paid parking, and then any reactions to these recommendations.
Lorelei, in any of the studies, like in Hood River, when they implemented the meters and things, was there any sort of study that found out what it did to the neighborhoods that were outside of the metered parking? I mean, if you're 2 blocks off of Main Street where the meters are, wouldn't people go there to park, like in front of my home?
I'm not aware of a study specifically in Hood River that was looking at the impacts on adjacent neighborhoods, but I will absolutely say that that is a thing that you would need to consider. And given the size and scale of the city of Manzanita, might be a reason to think about a paid parking program that applies blanket across the whole city, but exempts residents from having to pay. So there's ways that you can kind of get around that particular issue, but would need to be considered through a more detailed process and with someone who knows a whole lot more about how you set up paid parking programs than I personally do.
And I had another question. An area that we go to, a tourist area, has a permit that people buy online to come into the area. And residents, of course, are exempt from that permit, but it allows them to park anywhere. And, it's sort of like the permits that we pay for at the state park. Did you look at anything along those lines?
Yeah, that's what I was just referencing. That could be an option for you as opposed to stalls.
Okay.
Yeah, so that's kind of a zone.
A zone area.
Yeah, exactly. A parking zone where you need a permit. And it could be applied across the whole city given the scale of Manzanita, or it could be applied in particular neighborhoods.
Thank you.
Mm-hmm.
I'd just add, because I think some of you know I'm a bit of a parking nerd, and we actually have one of the best kind of parking consultants in the state is here, that there are a number of different ways that you can cut that, but that's why the analysis is so essential, because it helps us understand where the main demand is, where are those zones that would be impacted the most. And so having kind of a comprehensive study allows us to then come up with a comprehensive solution. And the technology now is so much more advanced that you could even have, for example, license plates that are registered, and then our code enforcement person would be able to just run it by license plate. And so there's a number of different ways that could be implemented. But as Lorelei mentioned, doing the study first and looking at what the options are in terms of the administrative overhead costs would get us to the right place that we need to be.
Thank you, Layla. And just as a reminder, the purpose of the analysis that we have done here is just to give you some ballpark figures to help you think about kind of how it fits in with the other revenue tools that we're considering, and to give you enough context about the decision points that are in front of you to determine whether or not you want to move forward with completing a parking study, which could really answer some of those questions for you. And I mean, I would just say again, we're looking at it from a revenue perspective, but there are other reasons to think about paid parking, and those are the kinds of things that a full study would get into.
Okay. Are there any other questions from council?
I got a question, Lorelei. I'm sorry, my computer is completely freaking out, so I don't know if you can hear me.
Well, we can hear you fine.
Okay. Did you say that the food is on the food and beverage sales for 2024 were $8.15 million? Is that, that was in Manzanita?
Well, I mean, that's 2024 hasn't happened yet. So it includes, it's a projection forward and includes inflation to 2024 dollars. And as I was saying, it's an estimate based on data that we have access to that helps us to understand it, that does not take into consideration seasonality. But the dollar amounts that we were projecting are pretty consistent with what we're seeing in other communities. If you think about scaling it to a size, the city the size of Manzanita.
Thank you.
Mhm.
Is there any other questions or discussion? All right. Well, quite a lot of information to digest, Laura Lee, and I think we've all got a lot to talk about as we look at the full proposal. Do you have any other questions from us? Can you hear me?
Yeah, we can hear you. Mhm.
Oh, okay. All right. Okay. Then if there's no more discussion on that, we'll move to the next item on the agenda.
And just so folks know, sorry, Mayor, if I might. So thanks, Lorelei and Deb. Appreciate that. The next steps just for the team is they're going to finalize the report, get that to the city. And then I'll be working with council to set up a series of work sessions so that we, you as a council, can start to digest some of this information and then determine what you believe the most appropriate next steps will be. So as soon as they finish that report, that completes their work with us, and then our work begins. But I do want to thank Lorelei and the whole ECHO team. I just think it's outstanding work, and it's going to be a real help for all of us. I've already got Wheeler and Nehalem asking if they can get a copy of our report. So, so thank you very much, and look forward to hearing from you.
Thanks very much, everybody.
Great work. Thank you.
Bye-bye.
Goodbye.
Bye.
Hey, I'm going to sign off because my screen's completely frozen. So I'm going to sign back on. So go ahead without me. I'll just be right back.
Okay.
Sounds familiar, Brad.
We've all been kind of hit with computer bugs today.
Josh said that Zoom did an update and it's bugging out everywhere. So I think it's just always, it'd be good to wait for Brad because it's good stuff next, but just a good reminder to all of us that being patient with technology.
Yeah, I got a note from Josh asking if I was using my phone for this. So we'll wait for Brad to come back on.
There's Dan.
I see Dan. Hi, Dan.
Hello.
Thank you for joining us today. I have to say, I talked to some people the other day that said you put out a weekly report on Dorcas Street,
Yes.
saying what you've achieved and what people can expect going forward. The people that were bragging about this very much appreciated that effort and talked about how useful it was for them, particularly the ones that live in the area. So thank you for doing that. It's that communication is really important. Appreciate it.
It does make life a lot easier for them and actually for me. So lots of questions.
Great. So did we get Brad back? I'm not seeing him. Do we continue forward without him, or Layla, would you say yes or no?
If he's using Windows, it probably takes a few minutes to boot back up.
Ah,
Got to feed those squirrels in those machines.
Yeah, I'd hate for him to miss any of the good stuff.
Yeah.
And my bit's kind of small, so if we're concerned about time, I think we're tracking pretty well. So it's really your call, Mayor. So I'll just defer to you.
Well, I really appreciate it. Are we doing the water rate? Dan, are you going to go into the water rates first and then go into the?
No, I'm going to start with kind of the state of where we are with the water system and talk about the water system stuff. And essentially, I will finish off with that and tail into Tim with OAW, who will talk about the rate study and information.
Okay, there you are, Tim. All right. Should we try to call Brad and see where he is? Linda, would you want to do that? And
Yeah,
I think
I'll call.
I'm back on. Nope.
see if we can.
I think I'm back.
Oh, okay, there you are. Hey,
Sorry.
we
I'm
have been
sorry.
waiting. Yeah,
I'm so sorry.
we have been waiting for
It's
you.
not you, Brad, it's Zoom. So don't worry about it.
I also wanted to thank Layla and Nancy for putting together these programs prior to the meetings. Sometimes we get them like during the meeting, and it was really useful to be able to go through things earlier the day before, and particularly with so many charts and numbers. So with that, I will thank you, by the way. With that, I'll turn it over to Dan.
Okay, so everybody disappears off my screen, but everybody, I take it, can see my PowerPoint.
Yes, we can.
Yes, we can.
So what we're going to do today is talk about our water. And this is the water system that supplies water to those inside the city limits, outside the city limits, and a little bit about our transmission lines and things like that. So we're going to talk from the very beginning to the very end of the system. So part of the system is the staff. And I kind of wanted to touch base on this because I do get a lot of people talk about our staff, and I wanted to make sure we have a bit of an understanding of how much we do as a staff department with the little amount of staff we'd have, and kind of give you also some general notes in there. You can kind of see how other cities that are actually pretty close to our size, how staffed up they are. So that's why I'm really been proud about my utility crew and what they've been able to do. So there's myself as a director. We have 3 utility workers. We have a part-time utility worker position, which I'm throwing a little carrot out there, is still open for anybody that knows anybody that's looking for work. So, and then we have a water billing clerk who's also the admin assistant. So Public Works, we take care of water, roads, parks, public restrooms, trash cans, doggy stations, building maintenance, pretty much everything. So we do it all. I wanted to introduce a lot more of my crew. Jason Wise, he's been hired and has been with Public Works Department since 2019. He has a distribution certification, so the state does their certifications in levels of 4. So typically when you get into the bigger cities like Portland, they have people that are all the way up to that level 4. Jason is my right-hand man, and he will hopefully be testing here in the next week or 2 for his water treatment certification.
Good.
Jeremy has been with us since 2021. He came from Spectrum and RTI, so he brought to the city a lot of information about other utility stuff in the ground, which has been a huge help. In the coming weeks, he will actually be taking his Distribution 1 test. The state requires for these tests to have typically 1 year of full-time service in that field. So, which is really difficult because we cover so many different fields. So typically to get a Distribution 1 certification, it takes you roughly about 1.5 years, almost 2 years working for the city to be able to be eligible.
Interesting.
Yeah. And I can also tell you, as I'm kind of going through this, we are filling in positions, but there are places right now that are in dire need of water people. So we are super lucky we have the folks we do.
I think I met Jeremy at the Pine Grove putting chairs up after the last council meeting.
He's a great guy. And then our newest one is a younger gentleman. His name is Josh Hamilton. He came from actually worked at Les Schwab, and before that he worked at the gas station. He's a strong back, and he's very eager. He has been great. He's learning everything super fast. We are really lucky we got him. He's already been through a class on how to fuse HDPE pipe. Him and Jason both went to it. And so HDPE pipe is that real resilient stuff that's flexible, movable. So right out of the gate, he's already learning all the tricks of the trade. So he's also a cadet with the Nehalem Bay Fire and Rescue District. So hopefully here in the next few months, he'll be a full-blown even firefighter there.
Ah, nice.
And just real quick, if I might, Dan, for our water utility workers that Dan just mentioned, we do have a requirement that they live within, I think it's 20 minutes of the city. So I just kind of want to emphasize how fortunate we are to have, both really dedicated and great teammates, to have folks that can actually afford to live within 20 minutes of the city of Manzanita is a pretty rare thing indeed. So retention is something both Dan and I really focus on with our team. So I just wanted to mention that we're not only lucky, like we're darn lucky. So
Yeah.
thanks, Dan.
Yes. And that actually is true. The fire service has been through some national programs, and now they're saying your best way to keep employees and get employees is to keep the ones you have. So the best defense is your offense. So Lori has been here since 2021. She took over our water billing software, and that right there has been a bear cat in itself, learning a whole new system and trying to get it to work to meet the city's standards and needs we have. So she's in the office, also keeps the office moving. So if I'm out of the office, I have essentially two people that are kind of filling in my roles. Lori takes care of the kind of the office stuff, and then Jason takes care of the more field operation stuff. So it's very nice to be able to get away and not have to worry my cell phone might go off. I still watch for it, but it doesn't go off near as much as it used to. Mm-hmm. So the water department, though, is also supported by many here in the city. You know, I'm constantly talking with Layla on different subjects with the water system, street projects, getting advice on certain things, planning stuff, actually, even, you know, if it's a planned project or something that has to do with water. So I have a lot of contact with Layla. Nina, you know, does all of our essentially accounts billables, payables, takes care of us that way. She is our HR person. She also helps me out with the grants and such. So, because there's a lot of financial record keeping and it has to be done through the feds that way. Nancy, who's in the front office, you know, she's constantly sending notes that come from folks, directing them to the right people. I talk with Scott on a daily basis. And also, I don't know if folks know, Scott was a former employee of the Public Works Department. And he also is a big hand for if something big comes up and I'm here, or if I'm not here, he's always been there to help out with the guys to kind of square them away if they're not sure on something. So Judy and Chris, they also help with us. We have found a few leaks and things like that. We're able to make contact to homeowners. It's like I said, it's a huge part. Even the police department. Just recently, they helped us with an incident where somebody was setting little tiny toilet paper fires. And so as soon as we had some information, they were right on it. So all of these people help out. We've had reports of water leaks the police see because they're out on patrol. They see a leak on a home that the homeowner is not around. They call us immediately and say, hey, I'm at blah, 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 there's a leak. And so everybody helps out in the system.
It's a community. Mm-hmm.
It is.
Mm-hmm.
So other parts of it that help in the water system, the elected body, you folks, you know, people in the public are great helps, but the elected body is what has to make choices for the water system and set policy. Public Works Augment Team, I always have to throw a thanks out to them. That's Lee and that crew. We also help and get help from the fire district, EVC. So it's a huge community to make the water system to what it is. So now we're going to jump into the water system. And I apologize if this map is kind of small, but I'm going to kind of peruse through it. And I don't think you guys can't see the cursor on the screen, can you?
Yes, we can.
Okay, good.
Oh, yeah. Yeah, it's there.
Okay. So where my cursor is, this represents our wells that are out at Foss Road. And both wells are rated at 500 gallons a minute each. And the way the water goes is it comes out of the ground. We put it through a CO2 stripping tower that we installed back in 2018. This was to raise the pH of the water, so we didn't have to do it really with a bunch of chemicals. There was the cost. We did a cost look at it. It was about I think off the top of my head, was about a 15-year payoff. City Council said, yeah, let's do it, because they agreed we don't need to feed chemicals to people that if they don't need it.
Okay.
So the water comes through, goes through a set of systems. We watch the water chemistry out there, and then the water heads itself into town. On its way in, there is a water service that feeds Route 53 water, which is a special water district. They were formerly known as Zadok Creek.
Oh.
And then also it serves Tideland Water, which is also another water district, a special district. And they're special district / co-ops. is what they are. And then it also feeds over to Wheeler, who is our partner in this whole process of our water source. So the water then passes through the treatment plant, gets pushed up into our reservoirs, and then you can see on those lines it gets a little complicated, but eventually ends up in the water distribution system. One of the things that we do that's not a required of us, but it's just a really good practice, is you will notice there are 3 indicators on the screen of pH and chlorine residuals. We watch that water like a hawk. So a lot of systems don't have the capability of doing that, but we do. And so that really tells us if something is off, we can catch it really quick and deal with something.
And Dan, I have a question. The water treatment plant, is that the one that's down on 101?
Yes, it is.
And so all of our water's going through that?
There's a booster pump in there that boosts the pressure up a few pounds just to get it up to the reservoirs.
Okay, I was under the impression that it wasn't operating, but you're saying it's...
The water filtration part of that plant is not.
Okay, got
One
it.
single little booster pump is all it's running in there.
Okay, thank you.
Yeah.
Do you have a plan for the water treatment plant of the filtration system in the future?
Well, we have a outlook that someday we want to put in the emergency well, but other than that, as far as like trying to reestablish the Anderson source or something, no, there's no plans at this time for that.
Okay, and what kind of time frame are you looking at the emergency well?
I don't really honestly have one. I have been working on that one along with our reservoirs to essentially pay for it by grants. And the next steps are on it is essentially we have to talk with Water Resource Board. And we've kind of started those talks, but we have kind of put it on pause as workload has been real heavy on other projects.
Okay, thank you, Dan.
Yeah. So this is a nice map. It kind of shows roughly the area and actually where our water sources are. I would start down in the far right corner. You can see out there is our well site. And so the blue lines represent the water transmission line coming all the way to Manzanita. So it is quite a length. We also have on there the green line, which represents the old transmission line that used to come from the dams. And so the surface source is up in the area in yellow, which is not property that's owned by the city. That is all private timberland up there. So our well.
I had a question down on that last slide when you talked about the timberland. I know there's a lot of spraying that the lumber companies do. Is there any concern there for those kinds of chemicals coming into that watershed?
Yeah.
Okay.
So we don't control it. That was one of the things. The water was shut off. Essentially, the city stopped using that water surface. One, it doesn't produce enough water essentially from spring through fall.
Okay.
Seasonal. Yeah, and typically we would hear about the spraying of the area that essentially feeds the water in there, usually the day of or the day after they spray.
Right.
So
Okay.
I don't like chemicals going into water.
Yeah,
so.
We don't either. Thank you.
Yep. So our wells are located up by Mueller Sand and Gravel. They are the little tiny spots you can see in the red. And so our wells are in a beautiful, and we'll call it an aquifer, but it is essentially a Mother Natured sand filter system. And so they have tested those wells at 1,000 gallons a minute, sustained for 48 hours. And so they were able to produce that amount of water. The area which those are located is actually has the ability for 12 total wells to be installed. We've only installed 2 out of the 12. So we have lots of water capability up there.
Do we own that property or is there an easement for that property?
We do have, well, the city of Wheeler has a lease for the property that's an ongoing lease. And I believe it's for the lease was for 100 years for, I think the city paid $1. And so all the water rights and the property are in Wheeler's name. The wells themselves, the building and the transmission line belong to the city of Manzanita. So what this does is create a very symbolic relationship between the two of us that not one of us can say, you know what, we're cutting you out. So we do have in our agreements the amount of water, how it gets divided up, and then we do billing based upon actual usage of water and the equivalent dwelling units, the EDUs that you hear about once in a while. So
Thank you.
yeah. So currently we're pumping at 500 gallons a minute. And so we have the capability to essentially bump that right up to 750 by changing a couple switches in a program. The well fields, like I said, were designed for another 10 wells. The booster pump station, when we had that CO2 tower put in, we actually set ourselves up for the future and allowed for even a third pump to be installed if so we needed it for capacity.
So Dan, what's the difference, and maybe you're going to get to this, what's the difference between summer and winter usage of the water? And is there any potential capacity issue?
So, the slide we're on right now.
Oh, good. Thank you.
Okay. So essentially, I broke some numbers out. So at 500 gallons a minute, we can pump roughly almost 750,000 gallons a day. And so that is a lot of water in a year. Numbers up there. So 262.8 million gallons of water. At 750, we can pump just over a million gallons a day and almost 4 million gallons in a year. So what I wanted to be able to show was our highest and lowest, because I get a lot of comments about, we're at our max capacity for water flow. So July has been historically our highest month of water usage. And so roughly, when we're pumping at 500 gallons a minute, we are using in July, we use about 74% of that capacity. If we switch to the 750 gallons a minute, we'd be using about 49% of the capacity. Now, February, the flip of the coin, you can see our usage is 7 million. We're less than half of our summer usage, which is a little problematic sometimes because we have a lot of water we store. But you can see in the winter months, we're only at 36% essentially, or 37% our pump capacity at 500 and only 25%. So I put the total well usage for the overall year. We used about 46% of our capacity for the whole year 2021, which was one of our highest years. And that's why I didn't actually choose 2022, because we saw a pretty good actually decrease in the amount of usage, especially in the winter months. So COVID year, that first year of COVID, really saw a heavy use on the water system, but you can see even at that, it only used 46% of the usage. So I also point out I got information from Cannon Beach and also from Rockaway on their totals for the year on their usage. So we're not that too far off from Rockaway. Cannon Beach has a bigger commercial area, so they use a little bit more. So
Dan, I had a question. You mentioned when the water sits in the reservoirs, it can create some problems, or when we get so much rain and the water in the reservoirs doesn't turn over. What is the issue there,
So what happens is we get so much water, it sits for a while. We actually go out and flush some of our hydrants to help get water towards the dead end areas, because the water sits too long. And it's not a code violation, but once again, I have pretty high expectations on our water system.
Glad you do.
And so we go out and we flush. The other thing we haven't seen it yet. Some of the neighbors hear it. When we start transitioning into the warmer months, the reservoir actually kind of does a turnover effect. And what happens is we see just a little bit higher chlorine residuals. Mm-hmm. So those you don't want to typically see. That's because you're storing too much water. Okay. And so that's kind of leads into that whole thing with the new reservoirs. When we go to that, we'll actually lower our capacity just a hair, but we will also have the ability to turn one reservoir completely off. We don't have the capabilities now.
Okay, thank you for the clarification.
Yep. And so the water treatment plant is currently in storage mode. So this kind of talks a little bit about the water plant. The plant itself was designed to produce only 500,000 gallons a day. It is listed right now with the state of Oregon as emergency source. So if you go on the Oregon Drinking Water Program, you can see that. The plant is actually built on tanks, and this is something a lot of people don't realize. We actually have 80,000 gallons of fresh water at the water treatment plant. We have another 60,000 gallons of raw water, meaning that water that could be filtered. And then we have 250,000 gallons of what's called backwash water. And essentially that's water that has settable solids that come out of it. And that water could actually be refiltered and capture a lot more of that water. So we actually sit as an emergency source. There's quite a bit of water there. So our distribution system is on here, and you can it's hard to see on, oh, darn this thing. You can kind of see the area that's inside the city limits. Essentially, if I take the cursor, it goes up like this, and that's our city limit area. This little section in the southeast corner, and then all of Pine Ridge, the Glade, the Promenade, all of that area is outside our city limits. So we actually extend quite a ways out. So our water distribution system, this is the water mains and the streets and everything else. We have our water mains vary in size from 2-inch to 10-inch, and the materials are varied quite a bit. PVC is a good material. We have water mains in the sizes from 2 to 10 inch in PVC. Asbestos is not the best for water mains. It's pretty strong stuff, but it really, really dislikes ground movement. And when there is a failure in it, it's not just usually a small leak. It's usually a catastrophic failure. And we have that sizes, that's a mistype. We don't actually have any 2-inch, sorry. We have 4-inch through 10-inch of that. What we do have also in our system is ABS. It's a really super thin wall stuff. If you look at it funny, it likes to break. It is probably by far the worst in our system, and it's stuff we've had to patch together in lots of different places. Yeah. And then we have some 2-inch glued electrical conduit that has been turned into water main. I don't know why. Somebody got cheap way back when, and so it's also on essentially our list of stuff to do. So we jump back to previous on this. So one of the things I would emphasize we also are now doing is we are now using high density polyethylene in our distribution system. All of our transmission mains are made of it. And HDPE, you'll hear me talk about, is the very, very resilient. You can put it on the ground and bend it around and move it and everything else. So in the Dorcas Street project, from here on out, we're essentially replacing all of our water mains with HDPE. The Dorcas line will be made of 8-inch HDPE, so it will be resilient and it's of proper size. What's in there now is an old 4-inch asbestos line, which Layla got to unfortunately see have mass failure on that one. And asbestos,
you don't ever want to see that.
Yeah.
No. So those 3 bottom ones are essentially been my target to get rid of.
So Dan, would you, and you've confirmed this with me several times, but asbestos, the use of asbestos lines is not essentially like the asbestos you have on a building. How dangerous is asbestos as a pipe? How dangerous is that?
So we still test for asbestos in the water. And they do have a threshold. We don't even come close to that threshold. Asbestos airborne that's frangible it's bad. And so that's why one of the reasons why, like asbestos water mains, when we do work in it, we leave all the pipe in the ground, we cap it off, and we bury it. And that is the preferred way of dealing with it.
Okay.
We can't even cut it with a saw where we can create dust. We have to keep everything nice and wet and keep water flowing as we're cutting the material, just so that the workers don't get put in a bad situation. So does that kind of get
Yeah,
where
but drinking the water that we're drinking out of asbestos lines that are currently being used for water transport, is there any issue with us ingesting? I mean, is there any problem at all with ingesting?
I've gotten a little bit of mixed results on that, but according to what I'm told, no. And that's why they put a really, really high threshold on how much you can have in the system.
Okay.
And so, but once again, another thing, really, do we want? So
I assume that's on your list of things to fix.
yes, like I said, asbestos, ABS, and the glued conduit are definitely on my list.
On your list. Okay.
So a couple other things. We have what we call emergency connections, and we have backup, water backup. So the emergency connections, we have an emergency connection with Neocani Water District, which back in 2001, I think it is, was actually put in place when we had a catastrophic failure on one of the transmission lines from the dams to the city. At the time, we didn't have a water plant. And so we survived off Neocani water for a short amount of time. And it actually took the fire department with 2 fire engines pumping to help keep water coming to the city for that to work.
Wow.
We do have also an emergency connection with the city of Nehalem. There's a broken valve. They are working with their city engineer, who's North Coast Civil, for repair replacement. So they've been in contact with me about trying to get that taken care of. And so these emergency connections are designed to be able to work both directions. So if they have a water emergency, we'd be able to supply water to them and vice versa. One of the other things we have now too is water backups. And I have found a lot of cities do not do the backups like we do. We keep 2 pallets of water, bottled water, at the water plant. And we have an agreement with the fire district. They use up the water. And as they use up the water pallet, we replace the pallet with another pallet. So as many of you seen and heard, we also have a water purification unit that can produce about 17,000 gallons a day. And then we also have the water treatment and distribution trailer that's currently in progress, a piece of equipment we're putting together. So backup for a backup. So Manzanita, this is very interesting, we have a population of 660. But yet for our water system, we have 1,915 water connections. And you'll see, kind of as a caveat to that, Rockaway has quite a few more than us, but we beat Cannon Beach in residential connections.
Wow.
Yeah. So commercial wise, both Rockaway and obviously Cannon Beach have more commercial than we do. But it kind of puts it in perspective.
Just remember the difference between staff. That Dan's team is, I think, a quarter of the staff that they have at Cannon Beach, and we manage more line of pipe than they do.
Yeah. I actually just recently got some information on them as I was doing this. I just found out they actually employ 43 people in their staff, in their whole staff, not just their public works. So, yeah. So once again, though, those numbers really show how hard my crew works to keep us above water.
Hey, Dan, this is a question not necessarily directly about the water system, but I'm just curious, comes up in a lot of context. Of those 1,915 connections, do you have a sense of how many of those are full-time residential connections?
I don't have a notion, Jerry, on how many are full-time versus second homes. We do now track in our system which ones are STRs and which ones are just regular residentials.
Okay.
And so
I think our average household size is close to 2, Jerry. So if our population is 600, then my guess is we're somewhere between 300 and 400 households that are full-time, and then the remainder would be second homes.
Gotcha.
Yeah. And to the state, when the state looks at us, because we have this kind of an odd relationship between short-term rentals, second homeowners, and our regular population, most cities and stuff, their standards are set on their standard population. The state looks at us and actually says we are a population of 3,300. And so they use that for actually setting the rules for what we have to do for the water system. So it's kind of an interesting.
Yeah.
So some outlook. So projects and goals moving forward. So a major part of the water system, I'm hoping by the summer, as soon as the sun gets here, we want to get the rest of our system in the GIS system. And why this is important is because it helps with, future CIP stuff. It helps us with the value of our water system, replacement costs, things like that. Because right now, if somebody came to me and said, hey, I want to know how many valves you have, honestly, we don't know. We don't know how many lineal feet total we have. We have a rough idea, but we don't know the exact number. And that's what GIS will give to us. And it's real helpful when my boss, Layla, is a GIS guru. She can take that information, pull it in, and do all kinds of nice reports with it. So we're going to continue moving forward with the project of scoping for the next 10 years on both street projects and water projects. And I want to make sure people understand that there is a difference between on our project list of street construction projects and actual true water projects. Water projects are just projects that we're looking at, maybe water mains, a lot of stuff that's outside in the urban growth boundary, stuff that's under gravel roads where we're not having to do other parts of roads, just the water. We're going to continue on the reservoir replacement project. It is a little bit of, a process to get there, because when you're dealing with federal money and grants, they take time, they take a lot of work, but we are continuing to move forward with that. And then some other things that are in progress right now, a water rate study, which Tim will be talking about on how we pay for these type of projects, the CIP, things that we're looking at. And then one of the other things we need to get going on is we've already gotten some quotes on the SDC for water, but we want to get that updated. We just completed the stormwater SDC, as you folks know, and we're in the middle of the water rates. Hopefully we're at the tail end of the water rates study going into effect. And then there's been also our fees and everything else being updated. So balance, priority in the water mains, they are currently the weakest link in our system. So meaning when we start talking about like seismic resiliency and stuff, the resiliency report highlighted a lot of projects. A lot of those projects were like bleed out control at the edge of the water system and things like that. Well, if your water main is not strong in between there and the bleed out control is absolutely not really needed until we get that part hardened and strengthened. And that requires us replacing a lot of water mains. The water master plan calls for essentially 29,000 feet of water main replacement. And that is pretty much all the water mains that are asbestos concrete, ABS, and all that not good stuff. So now the question is, what's that?
Say that again, Dan. How many water mains need to be replaced?
So the project, the water master plan breaks down the projects actually block by block.
Okay.
And so what was done was it was looked at in the master plan to determine the materials that were used, the failure rate of that material, when the water main was put into place. And so they used that information plus information that we provided them, where we said, yeah, we've had 2 leaks on this main, or, Dorcas was a good prime example where we've had 5 catastrophic fails in less than a 10-year span. And so that's what they use to set a lot of the prioritization of those projects. So those project lists, though, there are 76 essentially projects listed in the water master plan. And those aren't like 76 projects we have to have done in the next several years. We do what we can do with the funding we have available and keep working on that list. And then in another 20 years, or if there's a big major change in the water system, at that point they redo the water master plan, recategorize the projects, and then reprioritize those projects. But right now, like I said, there's over 29,000 lineal feet of water main that they're calling out for replacement.
Okay.
So after July, when we complete roughly almost 970 feet of the 29,000 feet, that will be the completion of Dorcas, and that should be able to hopefully get most of the asbestos concrete out of that area.
That's excellent. And that is funded at this point, right?
Yep, that is funded, and they're digging in the earth as we speak.
Okay. So I have one more question. I've noticed on the water meters, they're different between different homes. Can you explain why that is?
So the water meters we use, are you talking about just the boxes or the actual meters? I don't want to get too far in the weeds here.
The meters themselves.
Okay, so the meters themselves, we have two different essentially companies that we have in the meter box. We have one that was made by a previous company, which was Badger Meter, which were retrofitted to our Mueller radios, and then we have actual Mueller radios. And so the meters themselves look slightly different, but they do the exact same job.
Okay.
The Badger ones don't read as accurate as the newer Mueller ones do, and they do not provide as much information as the Mueller one does. A Mueller one tells us essentially if there's backwards flow, so if there's like a backup, and then the Mueller ones we're putting in now, the new ones, they also have a remote disconnect. So here shortly, we should be able to actually shut water off to certain homes if they have one of those meters remotely without even sending somebody out.
Oh, wow.
Yeah.
And can you work remotely from is it Bueller, the other?
Yes.
So you're not going house to house anymore. You're really reading those electronically.
Yes. So right now we do what we call a drive-by read, and that's actually the drive-by read works for both of them at the moment. And shortly, through essentially what the council did a couple of years ago is he gave us guidance, was we are working to where essentially the water meters are seen all the time.
Right.
So if, say somebody has a leak on their meter, then that meter would send a message that says, hello, I have a problem. And then we would be able to address that problem immediately versus once every 3 months when we catch them.
Wow. Wow.
So,
And when do you see that being implemented? I remember those discussions. That's part of the reason I'm asking.
well, we have completed essentially step B, which was getting all the meters to the radio system. Now we're on essentially step C. Back then is we are implementing the infrastructure to be able to radio communicate with the fixed points. That equipment hopefully should be here shortly.
Oh, great. That's just outstanding.
Yeah. So it's going in steps. So that way we don't overload anybody, and that's the best we can do with essentially the people we have right now as far as what we're doing. So, but it will be a tremendous amount for both us as a city and for the public.
Okay, thank you, Dan.
Yeah. So the 10-year CIP is the project that a system, or the CIP plan is a plan that both me and Layla have been working on. There's a lot that goes into it. I've had a lot of people ask, well, why don't I start putting the CIP out there? Because it's an unfinished book. But there are a lot of projects on it, and some of it we'll be touching about on it today.
Yeah,
So-
and if I could just jump in real quick, Dan, just to clarify for council and also those watching, it's actually a 5-year capital improvement plan. Most CIPs are 5 years. The CIP that Dan and I are going to be putting forward as part of this year's budget cycle will be pretty limited because it will be focused on primarily water maintenance projects for which Dan has already prioritized and has included in his budget proposal. Those projects are incorporated into the water rate study that Tim will talk about. The remaining projects will be subject of discussion for the council over the next year. Dan will come prepared to provide you with, working with me, a prioritization of those projects. And ultimately, the implementation of those projects will be based on priority and available resources. So again, just kind of thinking about our Venn diagram of a number of the projects Dan mentioned are what we call kind of street projects too. So we're replacing storm road and water. So while we may have some funding for water, we don't have funding for the other two components. And so we aren't going to be putting forward any projects in this year's CIP that will require any additional funding beyond just water maintenance projects. So I just wanted to have people just be prepared in terms of what their expectations are of what the CIP will be. But we have a 10-year capital plan now in place that we can work with council to determine, again, based on the prioritization of need coming from Dan and I, to determine which projects council sees as a priority, and then how are we going to fund those. So I just think it's really important that both council and the public understand that we still have to find funding sources to help get through a significant number of these projects, and that this year's capital plan really is going to be focused on maintenance.
So yeah, so that is the huge part. Like I said, I've always in my department had a small plan, but it's so much nicer now to have the whole picture and be able to move that way versus kind of our old way. So once again, we were looking at projects, even in our 10-year, it only replaces roughly about 8,000. If we did everything in that plan, we're only looking at about an 8,000 foot essentially of replacement. So it's going to take some time. And the main part is, as Layla said many a times, it's all about the funding. Water main stuff can be replaced as fast as people want to pay.
Dan, didn't you say in a previous discussion that in general, though, our system's in pretty good shape?
It is. So we don't see the failure rates, even on our asbestos. We're not seeing real high failure rates in a lot of the areas of it. And so hence why, a lot of it, we're not really having to go after and be really super aggressive. I was talking to a fellow colleague up in Astoria and talking to them about main failures. As a city, we see probably 1 or 2 main failures a year, and we roughly see probably about 20 service line failures a year. Up in Astoria, he was telling me they were seeing over 36 water main failures in just under a year. And so that's pretty substantial. And so that's where the CIP really has to drive down on those areas when you're seeing such a high failure rate. Dorcas, honestly, was not, when we looked at that project, it was on our list, but it wasn't high on the list. But the more the failures were on it became the driving force, along with the fact that there was no stormwater in that area whatsoever. So that was essentially a big piece to move that project, had to move up forward in the priority.
I had a question, Dan. We talked recently, and you said one of the biggest helps that you could receive was to add to your staff. If you, I know you're looking for a half-time person, but if you brought another full-time person on, what would that look like? For what would that hire be?
So the majority of another person, if we had another full-time person, right now I would just be tickled pink just to get the part-time position filled. But in the future, as the city grows, we have to grow with it. Mm-hmm. And so that's, of course, my department and other departments as well. But that in ours, we would probably be facilitating somebody that was strictly in the water side of it, just because we have so much out there.
Okay.
But that's, like I said, that's hypothetical right now. I would just be, once again, tickled pink. Somebody find me a part-time person out there.
Okay.
I'll even buy whoever finds them lunch.
Sounds good.
And it's a 0.6 FTE, which means the city actually provides benefits at 60%. So just in case anybody's out there watching.
Okay.
I have to, there was a water system at the water conference I was at. They were doing a class on recruitment retention. And it was like a really good class. And then when I got about halfway through it, I'm like, wow, they're really selling this. And then as we get near the end, they're like, so yeah, we're going to be opening a new water treatment facility. And we are looking for, roughly, I think it was 36 people in the water industry.
Wow.
Everybody in the room's kind of looking at him going, yeah, we're under that same kind of thing. We're all looking for somebody.
We totally understand.
Yeah. So once again, let's see, I went back a slide. Okay, so essentially this really kind of covers a lot of the water system. I don't want to go too far. I know myself and Layla have talked, and we're going to try to do some more of these educational bulletins in the future. So to really get you guys in shape on where things are as far as public works goes. So with that being said, before we start going into the OAWU presentation, is there any other questions?
Not from me.
Okay.
Excellent presentation,
Stop
Dan.
sharing my screen, and then I'm gonna start have Tim start talking. So Tim from OAWU, OAWU, by the way, stands for Oregon Association of Water and Wastewater Utilities. So we are a member, and so that being a member, we make up part owner of OAWU. It's made up of all the water utilities in Oregon and wastewater. And so I can't think of anybody around us that's not a member of them. What Tim has been doing is looking at our budgets and what we spend currently in the water system. He's gone and looked at some of our CIP projects that we have on the horizon that we're hoping to get to. And so by doing this, he puts together essentially a water rate that the OEN operation and maintenance cost of the system. So what it costs to do business for us. So with that, Mr. Tice, I hand it over to you.
Thanks, Dan. I appreciate it. Mayor,
Yes.
council, public, thank you for allowing us to do this project. I don't think that anybody realizes when they ask us to bid these projects and you're going to pay us for it, how much more work that they have to do to get us this information.
Yeah.
And Dan and Layla have just been, email goes out, lickety split, the information comes back. I think I'm going to try to share my screen here if I can and go to here. Boy, technology is nice when it works. So I'm going to blow this up. I'll try to blow this up. Maybe. Maybe not. Okay, you should have this piece of paper. Layla, was this given to those who needed it? And did you?
Yeah.
Okay, thank you very much. So what we're going to focus on is this first column that says existing rates. And the reason I want to bring this to you is because what we're going to do is work from the upper left down into the lower right-hand corner, and then switch out a couple screens to just kind of share with you some of our findings, okay, essentially. We were fortunate enough, and we have some historical background with the city because we did a rate study back in 2014, which the council at that time did adopt. And those are the current rates that you see. Can you see my cursor?
Yes.
Okay, so these are the current existing rates that you have. I think it's pretty straightforward. Residential 5/8 by 3/4. These are the meter sizes. These are the existing rates. And you can kind of see here the allowance of water. Let me back up a little bit. A 1 unit of water is 1,000 gallons. So there are 4,000 gallons provided for the residential users inside and the residential users outside. Okay, the commercials folks do not have any allowance associated with the size of their meter. Following down below that column C, if you can kind of see this number here, the 1.37 million is the current proposed budget that we're going to shoot for. Well, let's not shoot for. We based the existing initial review on that number. And one of the things we came up with was the anticipated review revenues based on those existing rates that you can see just above here. I'll slide back down. These existing rates here, and your water sales will generate about $925,000. That's a little bit of a shortfall to meet the 1.37 million. Okay. So I want to digress a little bit and share with you some facts and figures that we've been able to extract from this study. Currently, the two numbers in red right here, the $2.50 and the $3.25, is actually what you charge for 1,000 gallons of water for anything over the 4 units for a residential user. And that's right out of the gate for any of the commercial users. So they don't receive any water. So for every 1,000 gallons, you charge $2.50 for anybody who lives inside the city and $3.25 for any district, any user outside the city. There's a reason why those numbers are in red. We have come to the conclusion for Manzanita to draw water from their source and deliver it to the tap is $19.40 per 1,000 gallons. That's quite a bit where we found this study, the biggest imbalance, so to speak, okay? One of the things that we wanted to do was, initially talking with Layla and Dan last month in their office, was looking at just some periodic adjustments to the base rates, and in looking at some of those things, they both looked at each other and said, okay, we're not really that aggressive on our capital improvement planning. Where do we want to go from here? And it was one of those aha moments that we considered there really hasn't been put a lot of effort or resources towards CIP for the last, probably since 2016. So along with that particular, I want to continue down below this column, and you can kind of see right here that Dan broke down total cost, capital construction funds, and maintenance funds, and came up with these figures right here, okay? And this is going out 4 years, even though we say a 3-year average. And the reason we move towards a 3-year average is I don't think it's fair for decision makers to expect them to be spending money beyond the timeline that they may be sitting in these chairs, making these decisions. So we usually have elections and that kinds of stuff. And as new people are coming in, we try to transition what we're putting down on paper today and allow that to be able to transition for any new council members coming on. And you can kind of see here, Project A is 440,000, 146,000 average, 349, 300, and 500. And these are just 3-year averages. But I'm going to switch screens real quick, or at least attempt to. And taken from Dan's perspective, okay, these are the numbers, if you can see my cursor, that Dan has provided, and these are the same numbers that I just shared with you from the existing rates. One of the things that we do, and one of the things from our experience is there's a number in red, which is the 146,000, which relates to the 3-year average of the 440. Yes.
They don't see that screen.
I'm not seeing red.
No, we're still on the same screen you were just at.
Oh, okay. New share. Hang on. Thank you, Dan.
Yep.
Gosh.
Love technology.
Oh no, you are a lot younger than I am, and I appreciate your patience in helping me with technology. So, do we see the maintenance fund now?
Yes.
Yes.
Okay. Let me see if I can try to blow it up a little bit for you.
Okay.
If that helps a little bit. So these are Dan's numbers for total cost, construction, and what we're talking on maintenance is what the ratepayers would be charged with. Okay. The numbers in red are what Dan actually is sharing with us. The numbers in blue is our inflationary rate when that project is due. Okay. There's a couple things that we have learned from experience. First, when a project is bidded, and if there's any change orders or cost overruns, that it usually equates to about 20% increase. So let's simplify this. For project A, which would be 101, Phase 2, Pelican, Windward, and decommission of the reservoir. We're looking at Dan's cost, actual cost of 146, our inflationary cost of 176. But I think what most people want to hear is what that would cost per month per service connection. And here you're looking at $6.65 or respectively $7.98. Now, that is a straight across the board increase for those particular projects. Okay, that's enough said. If we continue to roll down, we accumulate. Give me a second here. Oops. We can see here, Dan's got projects B, A, B, Nehalem Avenue, Sandpiper, Phase 3, 101, C, and you can see how we say aggressive, more aggressive, most aggressive, and we have some alternative projects. What we simply did was take these costs associated with these projects A, B, and C, and D, and we related them to what it would cost per service connection per month. And you can kind of see as we aggress, oh my gosh, it doesn't work. Does it work? There it goes. We go from $6.65, which is right here. And if we really want to get aggressive into all of them, we're looking at $30, and that's $30 a month. And we think that's a little bit too aggressive, but I wanted to kind of share with you the costs that are associated with the CIP priority list, okay? Now, having said that, okay, we also don't agree with, there's a couple different approaches when we look at CIP. We can look at the actual monthly costs associated to each service connection, which I share with you in these examples. I think a more appropriate way, a methodology that's more fair, is looking at a single number per year that the water department can put towards the maintenance fund. So let me go back and share a different screen, go back to the original screen. Can everybody see the original screen? Okay. Okay. I think, yeah, okay. So what we did was, if you can follow across, this is our original budget. Taking Dan's figures from our meeting with Layla and Dan last month, we came up with a couple options. Okay, those options are adding $325,000 to the budget of 1.37 million. And this would be our total budget. And then we went a different direction at the 200,000 increase on the budget. Okay, how does that calculate out for the impact of the 3/4 inch users? You see here we're at 3950, it would go to 5373 or 5333.
Can I stop you there just real quick, Tim?
Yeah.
I just want to translate into sort of normal people terms. He's talking about the residential rate right now. So the majority of ratepayers are primarily residential ratepayers. And I just want folks to be very listening as we listen to this. There has been some kind of misinformation out there that we were doubling or increasing water rates by 50%. So I'm hoping that bad information can be dispelled with the accurate information. So we're talking about the residential rate at the moment. Sorry, Tim.
No, thank you, Layla. That is absolutely true. Single family residential homes do make up about 90% of the water system. Okay, they don't use 90% of the water, but they do make up 90% of the connections. Okay, so one of the things I want to back up a little bit. You see this allowance, and I said everybody is provided. Those single family residentials, both in and outside the city, receive 4 units of water. It might be surprising to you, but if everybody received those 4 units of water and used that 4 units of water on the average water sales, you would be overextended by about 13%, meaning that allowance of water is 13% higher than what your average water sales are. Okay, so you're kind of, that's another area where the balance is out of whack. Okay. One of the things we want to do is, if you see right here, is lower that allowance and allow the single family user to align, to feather in with what their actual usage is. And even though we're going to increase the base rate, we're going up $14. They're going to allow the single family residential full-time users a better methodology to be able to control their water bill with what the actual water they're using. Okay. That is
So
based on.
we took this, sorry, Tim. So when we discussed this as a team, and just wanting council, as you're considering this, maybe Tim, you can talk about the average usage. The majority of users actually don't use all 4 units, it's 2 or less. But this puts the city in a position where we can promote water conservation. So by having less units attached to the base rate, still being sufficient water for pretty much most users, it incentivizes users to stay within that rate, which from, you know, what we've been hearing from community members, what I feel like I've heard from council, is that this approach is a water conservation approach.
It is absolutely conservation minded, yes. So I guess the first question to council that needs to be consideration for our next meeting was, do we want to adjust the allowance of water? And that's part of the base rate that we're going to end up charging. Currently, it is 4 units, 4,000 gallons for residential users inside and out. And what we want to employ is a water allowance with 2 units or 2,000 gallons. And then you could see here a stair-step approach based on the meter ratio. I'm not going to get into the weeds with that, but the larger the meter you have, the higher allowance you would have. So out of the gate, everybody is charged equally. You mentioned about doubling the water rates. Currently right here, it's $39.50 and you're allowed 4 units of water. The average use is 3.66. Actually, I think out of 80% of those 3.66, they're right about the 2 units of water. That's how we came up with that figure. Dan and I are working on looking at averages based on the different classifications that the city incorporates for their users. Okay, so that number might change a little bit, but I think we're pretty close to center target on there. Okay. The other example, the other decision we need is how aggressive do we want to get with this CIP number right here? We came out with one at 325,000, thinking that might be a little too aggressive, but I wanted to share with the council a 200,000 towards the CIP. And then of course that will adjust the base rates here accordingly, and then your units of allowance would also come in fact. The problem I have with this particular example is the fairness, because a unit of water would have to be charged $10.50 per unit. Where do I see that being unfair? Large users will ratchet a pretty high water bill as opposed to this example right here. Okay. So we're still kind of massaging the numbers. I guess the biggest question is to what level do we want to aggressively look at the maintenance fund from the previous and what the impact is. I'll share that screen with you one more time. And what we're talking about is these different figures in red and blue, their relative cost, monthly cost per user, and then how aggressive do we want to get? And when I say how aggressive do we want to get, the first project would either create a 146 to 176,000 added to the budget for CIP. If you wanted to do A and B each year for the next 3 years, that'd be 316,000. And of course, we get way into the out in outer space, I think at 436 and 637. And again, what we're going to have to capture with these additional CIP fundings is we're going to have to capture somewhere about this much money per month per user. Again, I don't think it's the fairest way to approach it. I'd rather take these figures that the council gives us guidance on and apply it across the board to this other screen. And I'll do this coming back. So right now, your water allowance is a little bit upside down. You're providing 115% of the available average usage water that you have. That doesn't mean to say that you'll run out of water. Dan's already shown very factually there's plenty of water that the source can supply. Your allowance of water is 115% of capacity. When I mean capacity, that's average water sold, but yet you're only collecting about 67% to 70% of total revenues necessary for this particular number here, the 1.371. So we have that as a challenge. The next challenge we have is sliding across is we take this proposed budget and move it towards here, starting the July 1, 2023 rate increase. So with that, I will open it up to discussion, questions.
I have a question, and I think it's more for Dan, but given your limited staff, when you're looking at the level of CIP funding from the minimum to the more aggressive numbers, what is your capacity in your department to do that?
So the real aggressive essentially approach would be strenuous to us as far as management, because these are not projects that really Public Works will be going after and doing themselves. We might pick one or two small ones ourselves and do it, but a majority of these projects would be contracted out. And so that's how we get the most efficiency on it. Like Tim, we wanted to be able to show a whole barrage because I've heard a lot of feedback from, council wanting to be essentially pretty aggressive on our system, getting it resilient and things like that. So that's why there's quite a span on there of different projects. Essentially projects through C to me are manageable. And this is not something that would be all the projects done in 1 year. It'd be spanned over at least 3 years, if not a little more. But this starts putting money to do these projects. Right now, we rely solely on the Water Construction Fund. And this approach, the numbers seem kind of small for these projects, is because the way I went and looked at this and I talked with other cities and really did some feel around is 60% of these costs of these projects still would come out of the Water Construction Fund. 40% then would come out of the Operations and Maintenance Fund. So it brings that balance back in.
Yeah, and Dan, if I could table or feather on top of that, one of the things that the questions posed to Dan was simply the nail you hit on the head. Does Dan and his crew have the time to do it, both physically and financially? And all of this cost was outside contractors, correct, Dan?
Yes.
From start to finish. Yep,
these are all out as if they were being all contracted out.
Okay. Yeah.
So.
Let me ask a follow-up question. As far as you mentioned a systems development charge for the water system as well. Mm-hmm. Would that impact these numbers at all, or
this calculation?
Yeah,
this calculation. So that's going to be part of as we go into updating our SDC charge for water, because like I said, Layla's been really about getting that CIP in. So we're putting these projects together, and you have to have a project list and cost for the CIP to be able to set that SDC. So, and that will also balance to what you guys say on here. So if you're saying, hey, Dan and Tim, we want the water rates to reflect to do the projects, A through C. Well, we're going to make sure that the balance is met with the SDC charges as well for those project lists.
Gotcha. So in addition to promoting conservation, I'm assuming that, most of us have two members of our household. So when we're looking at these rates and this allowable usage of down to 2 units, so some of the houses that may entertain 16 or 12 people per weekend, they would be essentially paying more. Is that what I'm understanding?
Tim, take it away.
So thank you for that point. It's been something that I had written down, but I hadn't got that far. So there is a concern and a negativity when we talk about short-term rentals as it relates to water. And how do I say that? Just as Brad had mentioned, we have a home, 12 people are in the home for three days, and they're using about the same amount of water someone might use the entire month, which poses 2 questions. The first question is, does the city want to consider short-term rentals as a business? And if they are considered a business, then they would fall under the commercial rate, and then they would have an additional charge for the base rate, an additional charge for the unit cost. So that would be question number 3 the council should consider. More and more communities are looking short-term rentals as a form of business. They have a profit and loss that's associated with the rental unit, and the one thing that had never been considered was the impact on water and sewer, for that matter. You guys don't worry about that. So really good point. And if you say, yes, we want STRs to be businesses or commercial, then we will plug all the new numbers in and have it reflect accordingly, which I will share with you folks. The numbers in red, the 925 and 1050, would likely come down because you're collecting more revenues through the base rates.
Thank you.
So in order to sort of make that decision, I would think it would be good for us to know whether or not we might accomplish the same kinds of numbers based on the different rates for different amounts of usage. In other words, if we treat all STRs the same, then the STR that rents out for 4 or 5 weeks a year gets the same hit as the one that is booked 300 nights a year. But the 300 night a year operation might end up paying a whole lot more for water based just on the conservation driven rate. So can we have those different sets of numbers to compare before we paint with a broad brush?
Let me come at that from a different angle and share that something with you, Jerry.
All right.
The first rule that's usually a kind of a standard in the water industry is basing everything on meter size. Your meter is your cash register. So the 5/8 by 3/4 sets the tone for everybody. Because of the demand that commercial industrial puts on water systems with a much higher average usage and certainly a higher peak usage, it's justifiable to look at them as typically it's about 20% higher. So a $53 might be 59 or 60 bucks per se, if I'm doing the numbers in my head correctly. So when we get into dissecting how we're going to classify, we like to keep it pretty straightforward and simple based strictly on meter size. The next classification is which category. Are they going to be residential, or are they going to be commercial or industrial? And if we get out of that, it might create a little bit of a headache for the folks that are running the software implementation. where you have your first example, somebody might be renting out 3 or 4 weeks a year, okay, they're going to see a water rate increase based on that usage. Those that are renting out 300 nights a year will always be paying a considerable more because they're simply using more water. And that's where the final destination we want to get to is, if you're going to use the water, then you've got to be able to support that water department with higher revenues.
Most of the residential STRs would be the 5/8 by 3/4, correct? So their water rates, except for option 2, option 1 would stay the same. And you would just, depending on how many nights you rent, the occupancy, you just get slammed with additional usage.
Exactly. But if the council wants to move that to a commercial rate, they would fall into the $64 base rate plus additional usage.
And as far as the billing side goes, just so you know, Jenna, our software does have it designated in our system on who's short-term rental versus who's a regular residential, and that information comes straight from Judy, who coordinates the licensing and stuff.
So essentially, on the house that is rented 4 times a year, their base would be slightly higher, but they wouldn't more than likely be paying the additional money for the usage of water since they're not going to be using it that much. Where the family that rents it 365 days a year is going to use a lot more water, and we would be able to capture that for in that way.
Right, exactly. If you're going to use the water, you pay for the water.
Right.
And if you remember back from my slide where I showed those usages from wintertime versus summertime usage, that kind of paints that of that hard hit that does come to our water system. And as of right now, everybody in the water system essentially is paying for that larger usage. The concept of creating short-term rentals as essentially treating them as a commercials in the water system helps levels that playing field. They're paying for that higher demand that they're putting on the system. And correct me if I'm wrong, Tim, didn't Neocani Water, aren't they looking at doing the exact same thing with their short-term rentals up there?
Yeah, we just finished that rate study, and they took their base rates up 20% and their unit cost to 20% as well, which leads me to a great point, Dan. The numbers in red here, the 925 and the 1050, those will change, likely come down depending on how the council wishes to chew on this a little bit and determine if your STRs are going to be, commercial, what have you. But we're also going to do a follow-up on our final meeting with you and share with you a tiered structure that will correlate with average usage. So the more water you're going to use, you're going to stair step, or what we call an increased block rate. So, for a single family residential user, if they get 2 units and an allowance, they may go to 6 units and pay the $925. Anything over 6 units to possibly 12 or 15 units. This is the stuff we're still massaging a little bit. They may pay $10.50 a unit, and then anything above 16,000 gallons or 16 units, they'll pay $12 or something of that nature. One of the things that we do is ask that you consider the tiered structure. We highly recommend the tiered structure. And then after recommending that, the number one thing we see with the shortfall in water department revenues is inaccurate meters. And we only get accuracy with newer meters, and Dan shared with you, they're working on moving that through. The other thing, I can feel an arrow being put in a bow right now, and I'm going to get the shot here, is you really need to go to a monthly meter read and billing. And I share that with you for a couple things. There is a time lag from one meter read to the next meter read that you may or may not capture full usage. If you're not capturing full usage, particularly at the higher end, you're losing revenue. Okay, I don't know how complicated that can get for additional meter reads and additional workloads for those that are processing the bills. But a perfect example is if you're reading a meter every month and you're reading it to the units that we expect these meters to read, it's said and done. If you wait and you read bi-monthly or quarterly, what happens is you might run right up to a level that you're needing those revenues, but you're not capturing those revenues because you averaged it down, if that makes any sense. One of the things that I have not shared with you is we have to generate revenues every month, regardless if you're selling water, not selling any water, or selling exorbitant amounts of water, because there's a fixed expense associated with that water department that the base rates have got to cover the majority of those expenses. So those revenues are generated by what we're sharing with you on these, hypothetical base rates. Everything beyond that is generating revenues from water sales above and beyond these allowances, and particularly at a level 1. But we'd like to have you, I strongly encourage you to go to a 3-tiered approach. It's going to wake up a number of people who are kind of lackadaisical, kind of casual about water usage. We all hear the story about, someone turned their water on at 10 o'clock at night and they fell asleep in the chair and then they went to bed and the water's still on. You got water running down the gutter. That's not in a very, very efficient way to apply beneficial use of water. So we're going to capture some of those at the very, very beginning. And I'm not looking to change the way they live or anything. It's a really good approach to better manage the system, and it's going to generate the revenues necessary to look at the CIPs that we've laid out in front of you.
Tim, I have a final question. You said that the last time that our water rates were adjusted was in 2014.
Yes, sir.
What do cities our size typically, how often do they typically adjust their water rates?
When we get done with the report, you'll be adjusting them annually, and that's based on a consumer price index, which is not the consumer price index umbrella that we normally think of, but it's a smaller umbrella based on water and sewer maintenance cost. And we will provide that link from the Bureau of Labor, which would then each January, you can capture that year of inflationary impact and then apply that to the rates, and you can put that in resolution. You can simplify it even there and say, I want to go up 3% every year. If you said that back in 2015, you would still be shortfall because it's a 4.43 for the last 6 years. So,
yeah, and the city council did adopt a resolution that would include inflation, but then never implemented it. So I think it's important that community members and users know their rate hasn't increased to keep pace with inflation. And so effectively, we've been subsidizing water rates because of that. So while this might look like a 25, it's about a 20% increase here, had we adjusted for inflation, we'd actually be close to this rate right now. We just didn't do that.
right.
I think if I'm gathering what Councilor Mayerly is asking, it seems to me that you would do a full water rate study like we're doing now when you update your capital plans, because that is what really drives the change that we're talking about today as well, is that. So we had a new water master plan. We have not updated the rate since we had that new water master plan. So that precipitated this water rate study. So I think we would adjust recommendation would be we adjust by inflation based on that index that Tim provided. And then when we update our water master plan, we will initiate another water rate study to make sure that we're keeping pace with the capital projects that we're estimating. I think in the interest of time, Tim, it might be good if we could summarize for the council kind of I think there's three key pieces that we're asking. One being the units associated with each of the rate types.
Your allowance
Are
with
you
the base.
comfortable? I'm sorry?
The allowance, consider
allowance.
lowering the allowance along with the base, or align it with the base rates.
Lowering the allowance. What is your comfort level with the proposed capital projects in option 1 and option 2? How do you want us to look at short-term rentals? And would you like us to bring back a scenario that looks at tiered rates based on usage? Did I capture it all?
That's perfect.
Okay. So I think those are the 4 key points that we would like to get some guidance from council on. And then my recommendation is we come back to you at a work session with that updated information, and ideally be at a place where we can discuss, get you to a place of consensus where we can then move forward with adopting a new rate, ideally in June, if not by the 1st of July. At this point, I'll just say we can't make any budget estimates for this increase. So our budget will be based on our current water rate.
And Layla, are you, obviously, I believe you're working on the budget now, and when that number comes in, we will be looking at a option of what number we want to put for CIP, which would increase that budget.
No, the budget number right now is, as far as the number for the CIP, Tim, I think is based on the project list that we provided. So it's up to council right now as far as guidance goes. You know, once again, projects like just doing projects A and B, putting that in for those numbers to be able to use for the rate would be what we would be asking essentially. Like you said, you showed perfectly the different projects, the different costs. So I would say start with, as far as council goes, guidance. Do you guys, how aggressive do you want us to be on these project lists?
And do you want us to do that today, or do you want us to think about it?
You can think about it, email me, but we really got to kind of have kind of a rough direction of which we're going. Tim can, I think, run a few numbers. Tim, don't beat me up, but I think he can run a few numbers. But if we can at least narrow that down, so we have something to be able to move forward with.
Okay, and then when would this, assuming that we can make those decisions, when would this go into effect? When would the increased water rate go into effect?
The goal right now, correct me if I'm wrong, Layla, is July 1 is when we were shooting for the water fees to go into place.
Which would mean you need to make that decision June 7th, which means you need to have probably at least one more work session on this, which
Absolutely.
we can be ready on the 10th for that.
Okay. And then do we know right now what the average usage of water is in the city of Manzanita? How many reach the threshold where they pay additional money for the water? Do we know what that is?
Based on the current rates?
Based on the current rates, yeah.
I don't think I know that, because I don't know how. We know the average usage is 3.66 units, and you provide 4. So the majority of those, you're only going to collect the $39.50 for the base.
That's what I'm thinking. So right now we're at an average. We're using under 4,000.
Right.
And didn't you say that 80% of that, was it the 80% of that residential, was it right around the 2?
Yeah, 2.5. I think Dan's crunching some numbers right now on all the classifications of users, going to get it back to us so we can better define that and answer those questions.
I think that's important for the community to know as we make these decisions, kind of because I think people don't realize how little water we really do use. And the system that's set up right now is not necessarily in terms of the amount, not necessarily the most effective way to do that, particularly if we're looking at water conservation.
Well, and I think we don't want to, we're obviously increasing rates, but we don't want to over increase rates of the 660 people that live here as normal people.
Right, right.
So I think that, I mean, I'll just run through some of your questions, the 4 questions. Like, I think that 2 allowed units is good. I like the tiered approach with rates. Like if you use X number, 2 to 10, 10 to 20, I think a tiered approach, like if you're using an insane amount of water, pay for it.
Right.
I don't think at this point we should do STRs as commercial. I think there's too many buzzwords around STRs, but I think this will capitalize, even in their residential state, that they'll capitalize on the STRs, especially the big ones. Is there another one? Then the big question is like, how aggressive do we want to be in?
Right. In one of the things we want to propose on putting an average number, if you choose the 325,000 or the 200,000, we're going to lay that out for the next 3 years. And one of the things that's really a much different approach is having the ratepayers pay for the 325 or the 200, and knowing that that money is coming into the coffers as the water department is spending it. So as a capital project comes off that list, another one moves right on up. And then every 4 years, we look at that adjustment and see where that average needs to be. And then your rates with the CPI, you're going to be golden in each and every year, as long as we break that down each and every year. But Dan can do that.
I think
did it for me today.
I feel like I'm a little bit confused with the CIP numbers. The numbers don't seem to add up based on option 1 and option 2. Would those be kind of reversed if we did option, stay on your screen up at the top. If we did option 1, it seems like the number below it, the 1.69 number, should actually be in under option 2 column. I don't understand.
So the difference is the additional 125,000 that, you can't see my finger, is here and here. Okay. Yeah. When we ran these numbers originally, we wanted to keep everything as they were with a simple adjustment. But you come across here, you see how these numbers jump? Because this is the 20% for the commercial usage, which would then generate that much more money, which would then, so that's the difference. One is set at a base rate of 70%, the other one is set at a base rate of 75%.
And the base rate that's set at 75%, shouldn't that be a higher number?
No, because you have a lower total budget. Your budget is 1.5 versus 1.6. I know, folks, I apologize if this is confusing. It makes perfect sense to me. Okay, but these are some of the things I think we need to kind of talk through and discuss, in order to get I want each of the council folks and the mayor and Dan and Layla to actually have that same answer as to, if you all have the same answers to reasons why you're doing this, then it really opens up a level of transparency. The additional monies, the projects that are being finished, people will see that in the community. And there's that, again, reasons why we're doing this and the approach we're doing it. We want to absolutely be cognizant of the full-time folks that are living there full-time, and not have them supplement the businesses, but we don't want to have the businesses so outlandish that they're not going to want to do business in Manzanita, but then they pay their fair share based on water usage. And it's absolutely defensible in any which way you want to look at it.
But maybe Jenna might help is say, and the rest of the council too, instead of when we're looking at this, we have once again our everyday OEM, and say when we come back with some better numbers on here, that we show operation maintenance, our day-to-day, and maybe the optional price for option only project options A and B. we want to really hone this down is what we're trying to do.
That would be helpful.
We're not looking for you to say exactly this, and this, but we are looking for some guidance so we can get you a much tighter.
I feel very clear on like these numbers, like base rate, here's your allowance, here's numbers that come when you go over that. What I'm not clear is if we are less aggressive or more aggressive on our goals, our projects, how does that change? Will that change these numbers?
So, Councilman Jenna, if I may, if you really, really want to keep it very simple, if we do A and B, we need between $6.65 a month all the way up to $14.31 a month per user. But what I think I didn't explain very well, and I apologize, is it's very simple to say, okay, we're going to go after A and B every year. We're putting $316,000 towards capital improvement each and every year, and it's going to cost everybody $14.31. Okay, but having said that, I'd rather capture that $14.31 from the consumption revenues.
Okay.
Meaning, and it's a really good point, and thank you for bringing that up, because the 1431 for the full-time people that live there full-time, that could be a huge impact, and they're not really using any more water if you think about it. But if we could tie the water consumption to account for the 1431 to generate $316,000 additional revenues in a year, then these two sets of projects get finished.
I see.
Well, personally,
Called revenue diversification.
Right.
when I was out running for council last year, I did hear a lot of talk about water, and I think having a clean and safe and sustainable water source and system is really important to the people that live here. And I would just say I'm in favor of the allowance, decreasing the allowance. And I think, like you stated earlier, you use it, you pay for it. And however we tie that into these numbers, I would support that.
Well, the easiest scenario is Dan drives a great big old Dodge diesel truck, and I drive a small Prius, and I fill up for $10, and Dan wants a full tank for $10. The gas station attendant's going to go, here's your $10 worth, and he's going to run out of gas down the road. So, I mean, we almost need to think of water the same as anything else that we pay for in gallons. And, sorry, Dan, didn't mean to throw you under the bus.
That's a good enough.
I had a question for Dan. Dan, you mentioned that you would like to have some feedback from counselors on project priorities. Can you explain that just a little bit more, and what your timeline is, when you would like to hear from us?
So essentially what we're looking at, just these projects that are as part of the funding side of it. What I just need to, essentially what we're after is to be able to set the base rate. And these projects are not fully in stone, meaning we are putting money away. And if another water main becomes higher on the list, at least we have been starting to put money away for those projects. But these are the ones we essentially were looking at as a priority.
Okay.
And so this will definitely be well defined in the CIP. But I'm trying to pull pieces out as we're moving forward, because once again, if council says, no, we don't want to do any projects, well, that's going to change the timeline that me and Layla have to put in the CIP projects, So this is all setting the stage as we move forward. It's kind of a rippling effect.
Okay.
Dan, can I segue that? I think, Mayor, what we're asking for is a single number, whatever that number may be, in relative to the projects. If you say that number is 100, you're only going to provide $176,000 each and every year, then we will do all the projects in A over 3 years. If the council says, what has been presented today from $200,000 to $325,000 each and every year, then you're going to allow these projects to be finished in a more timely manner. So we're just looking for a number added to the budget that
Okay.
will take care of the CIP. And whatever that number may be is going to be discussed among yourselves.
Okay, I understand. Is there any final conversation or questions? Tim, you did a fabulous job on a very complicated topic, I have to say. I think we can get back to Dan if we have questions further as we move through this step.
Yeah, Dan knows how to get a hold of me 24/7. He's done
Okay,
it before.
good,
So,
good.
Okay.
Well, it feels
Dan,
like we're moving.
do you have a time? So if we want to have another work session on this and have Tim update these numbers, we're going to need some guidance prior to that. So if we have to wait till the next work session, then we're kicking it to June, which is fine. So I think, Dan, what is it do you have what you need for us to take it to the next step? Because I feel like generally, I haven't heard from everyone here, but I kind of want to recap where we are so that staff have a clear sense of what we're supposed to do next. But I guess barring any objections, I think there's some comfort level around the unit recommendation we're making, but you would like to see some data around that at the next meeting to show what that looks like. It sounds like there's some comfort level around maintaining short-term rentals as residential, knowing that the bigger users are going to be paying the unit rates as they use more water. But we're still sort of stuck on this, what's the dollar amount? And I think I did hear Dan say earlier, and correct me if I'm wrong, but Dan, do you have a recommendation of what you think is feasible to perhaps provide council with some guiding light as they look at these numbers so that we can move forward with that piece? And then the fourth thing I heard, again, barring any objection, which please object if you aren't, that we would like to see us bring forward a tiered approach. So for those that are bigger users, they're going to be paying a greater rate. So I think we have fairly clear direction on 3 of the 4 items. But if we want you, and you're welcome to take some time to get back to us on that 3rd item, you need to do it individually. When would we need that information so that Tim can be prepared to come back with that analysis, assuming we discuss this on May 10th?
The only thing I'd like to add to that, Leila, is I don't think we should take short-term rentals off that list.
Okay.
I'd like to keep them on.
And which list is that?
The
And you can still decide that because Tim will have, so making him a commercial rate versus the residential rate, is that right?
Yes.
So you still have time to decide that, of course, and we can just have that option as part of our discussion in May.
That would be great.
And I would like to explore a little more about the monthly billing that Tim recommended.
Yeah, I thank you. Dan and I are in conversation about that.
Okay.
It is actually a pretty big impact on our finance officer right now.
Okay.
When water
wondered.
billing happens, it really soaks up a lot of Nina's time. So I would humbly request that we defer any changes and allow staff to work through how that will impact folks. We're not prepared to do that right now. We just don't have the capacity. But we can work with Dan over the next year to see if that's something that's possible. But right now it is not.
Okay, thank you.
Thanks.
If we do stay with the quarterly, I'm assuming that's where you're at now. There will be some significant number changes because everything we're looking at is based on triple. Does that make sense? 3 months. Okay.
Well, I think Leila summarized what she's heard as general support from council. I agree with Linda. I'm not done with the STR thing. I think we need better understanding of the differential among the STRs. I don't doubt that there are some that are using huge amounts of water and others very little. And I get that we can get to that with tiered rates, but I just wonder if there may not be an opportunity to have some SDRs treated as commercial and some not. And I don't know without the numbers if that's even worth talking about. The big one we're having a hard time with, obviously, is the CIP number. And so, Dan, you had told in answering Brad's question earlier, you indicated that the most aggressive approach, even given that those projects are contracted out, that would still be pretty strenuous on your team, right?
It's strenuous not just on my team, but it's strenuous on the whole team.
Yeah.
As I was saying, like, this is a huge thing on Layla, myself, Nina.
Right.
I didn't put the number in there, but I would point out that Cannon Beach has 3 Ninas, by the way. So once again, hats off to her. She does it by her poor self, but she is strapped. And so that's one of the reasons too, Layla indicates, that the monthly read thing is not something we can do out of the gate, but it's a goal someday down the future, which might mean that, at some point we have to look at somebody else that helps out with the financing, because that's part of cost of doing business. But for me, the biggest thing I'm shooting for is looking at, once again, those two big numbers. And if you want to look at them as a whole, there's extra 176,000 in the budget, or 316 that goes into the budget, or kind of look at it. Yes, to me, C&D is pretty expensive and will be real strenuous. So I would limit, or my recommendation to council would be to look at options A and B as the goals. They're doable. I think they're cost effective enough, and especially in the 3-year term. So, and it groups some projects together. Grouped projects means less on mobilization fees and everything else. So we get more work out of our dollar.
And Dan, if I may, you laid out that Highway 101 phase 2, phase 3. If we do get the 316 or whatever that number might be, wow, if you did it all in one fell swoop, there's a lot of cost savings there. So
tremendous savings in that. So that's my recommendation to you guys. But once again, I've heard from you guys that you wanted to be super aggressive about laying pipe and stuff out. So, but my recommendation would be the max is to go with all the way to option B.
That's helpful. Thank you.
Yeah, that is helpful. I really trust your judgment on that too, Dan. Thank you.
I do too. Thank you, Dan. Thank you, Tim.
Okay, thank you, everybody. Have a great evening. We'll talk to you later.
You also.
Okay.
Layla, we move to a city hall, or do we have another 5 o'clock meeting?
I have a 45-minute presentation. No, I'm just kidding. We can move past it. I wanted you to have just some extra time because I dumped a whole lot of information on you at the last meeting to ask questions. I've had one-offs with, I think, everyone. So the only thing I wanted to just share at this time is that I have met with the state of Oregon, Business Oregon, and there is another, not potential, we were actually approved by their board yesterday to apply for the Special Public Works Fund. So that would be if the council elects to move towards a debt. That is sort of a third option, and the interest rate is significantly lower than what we could get through a full faith and credit debt obligation. So what I will be prepared to do, and I'd like to propose to the council, and again, remind the community that due to the budget timing and sort of getting all this information gathered, you will not be making your phase 2 decision until June. But I would like to suggest that we use the bulk of our May 10th meeting for this discussion about City Hall financing, where I will bring you the 3 options: the full faith and credit, the Special Public Works Fund, or the Oregon Bond Bank. There's actually 2 options in there, or what a general obligation bond would cost. I finally got reconnected with our financial advisor, so I should have all that data for you. And you will also at that time have been presented with the budget, and we can talk about the financial projections in that meeting. So you start to see the full picture. And so that's what I'd like to propose. And then we can use the other half to continue the conversation about the water rates. So if council's cool with that, then we can just defer it to them.
I am cool with that. I'm curious how that impacts the April 19th town hall presentation that you're going to do for the city hall.
It shouldn't impact it at all. We'll be presenting pretty much the same information that all of you have seen. But what we wanted is for the community to have access to the design team and to kind of see the latest drawings and to have an opportunity to interact with the design team. So
it's more about
budget number. I'm sorry, what was that?
Is it more about structure and design?
That's right. And then I'll present the budget that I presented at the last meeting. So our budget hasn't changed, but our financing options have.
Okay.
So I wanted to talk about that. And then I also met with the state too, and there is at least one grant that we are eligible for abatement. And so I'm submitting an application to the state as we speak for that grant. So we're making progress. Just wanted to share those bits of information. And as always, I'm available to any of you if you want to talk any details about the presentation. But I do think I've talked to everyone at this point. So thanks.
Is there any other? Thank you very much. That's nice to hear about an abatement grant, a grant for that asbestos stuff. Good way to go.
So I am weighing. I'd like to discuss Layla's performance review.
Yes.
And I know we've got about 5 minutes. I think I can do it within that 5 minutes. If you guys with me, I think it's important just to get us started. So the council completed Layla Aman's performance review on April 5th of this year, at which time the majority of council concluded that Ms. Aman consistently exceeded expectations. I think you've seen that today in spades. The city manager's role relies significantly on an effective strategic partnership between the city manager and the council. During the past year, Ms. Aman has helped bring one council to the brink of key decision points on a range of complex issues, and is now attempting to guide a substantially new council through that decision-making process. Given the challenging circumstances, she continues to make excellent progress in moving council goals forward while dealing with several major unexpected issues like LUBA, implementing a moratorium for dune grading, reviews utilizing TLT funds to help cover some personnel costs, implementing a new indirect cost methodology, and much more, all while running the system and the city. I don't think we all realize she's got an organization she has to run, as well as all of these projects that we've been talking about. I do want to take a moment to thank the community for the outpouring of support for Ms. Aman. It was wonderful. It was deeply appreciated by both Layla and the council. Because she has exceeded expectations, I am recommending a salary increase. Her current compensation salary is $10,750 a month. An increase of 3% would increase her monthly salary by $322 a month, 4% by $430, and 5% by $538. We can't make decisions now, and I think it's a major decision that I want council to really have the time to think about and to get community input. So I look forward to getting direction from the council in May to determine an appropriate next step. So I wanted to make sure we did that and to give the council time to think about it and to talk about it in May.
Linda, thank you.
Hey, Linda, can you send us a summary of those numbers?
I certainly can.
Thank you.
Anything else to add?
Parade's going.
The parade's going?
Yeah. You could thank Layla for coming up with a really creative way to get us some insurance. So that was really awesome.
Do we have a theme yet?
Yeah, it's something like bring the glory back, or bring back to glory. I think it's back to glory.
How about make Manzanita great again?
Oh, no.
Well, I think at that point, this is probably a good place to stop. We're all getting a little rummy
Okay,
from
we
a
got
long
another
day.
meeting.
We have a-
We have another meeting to go to. So I will adjourn this work session at 4:58.
Sorry, I know what it is now. I'm sorry, it's return to glory.
Yeah. Oh, return to glory. Okay. Thank
Return to
you. Okay. So we're going to adjourn this meeting at 4:59, and council has a one. Oh, I guess the public has a.
Yep.
It's open to the public. So we'll take
It is indeed,
take a-
yes.
a 1 minute break, or do we just move right into the next one?
You have to start a new meeting because it's got a separate link. So why don't
Okay.
we take a quick break and then beg everybody's pardon if we are off to a little bit of a late start.
All right. We'll do a 5 minute break and see you all back. Thank you.
Okay.
Meeting